Friends, if you want to watch the super hit and heart-touching movie Phenomenon from 1996 in English, then you should definitely like this video because today we are going to explore this wonderful film in great detail. And if you are visiting our channel for the very first time, don't forget to subscribe to our channel because we bring you in-depth information, interesting facts, and exciting stories from the world of cinema. In today's video, we will talk about the movie Phenomenon, a film that surprised audiences and touched hearts across the world with its unique story and powerful performances. We will discuss what this movie is all about, where you can watch it, which OTT platforms or satellite channels are currently showing it, and how you can enjoy this classic film from the comfort of your home. We will also take you behind the scenes to explore the technical side of this movie. We will talk about how the film was made, from the early stages of pre-production, through the filming process, all the way to post-production. We will cover the work of the technical crew, the quality of cinematography, the special effects, the music that played a key role in setting the mood, and how all these elements came together to create this memorable film. Along with that, we will explore the budget of the movie, how much was invested in its making, and how the film performed at the box office. Did it become a commercial success, or did it face challenges in the market? We will cover all of that in detail. Not only this, but we will also talk about the story of the film, what makes it so special, and why it still holds a place in the hearts of many fans even today. I will share with you a brief review of the film's plot, highlighting the key moments, the emotional depth, and what makes the story so captivating. In addition to all this, we will look into the fascinating facts about Phenomenon that many people don't know. We will explore the star cast of the film, the actors' performances, and the characters they played. Which actor brought which character to life, who gave the most memorable performance, and how each role contributed to the overall impact of the film. We will cover all of this. That's why I request you, friends, to stay with us till the end of this video, because if you are a true movie lover, you don't want to miss any of this exciting information. So let's start the video and dive into the world of Phenomenon 1996. The story of Phenomenon 1996 takes us on a deeply emotional and thought-provoking journey that begins in the most ordinary way possible. We meet George Malley, a humble and kind-hearted auto mechanic who lives in a quiet, close-knit town. George is the kind of person everyone likes. He's helpful, friendly, and just going about his life with simple dreams and a sincere desire to connect with those around him. One of his quiet hopes is to win the affection of Lace, a local woman who runs her own business and is trying to keep her distance from others because of her past. George's life seems so typical that no one, including himself, could have expected what was about to happen. Everything changes dramatically on the night of his 37th birthday. After celebrating with friends at the local bar, George steps outside, looks up at the sky, and is struck by an intense, blinding flash of light. It's a strange, almost mystical moment that completely alters the course of his life. From this point on, George starts experiencing incredible changes. His intelligence suddenly skyrockets. He becomes able to solve complex mathematical problems in minutes, learns foreign languages effortlessly, and begins reading several books a day, absorbing vast amounts of information as if his brain has become supercharged overnight. But George doesn't become a cold genius. What makes the story so powerful is that he remains the same warm, curious, and compassionate person. He wants to understand what's happening to him, but he also wants to keep living his simple life and stay connected to the people around him. The story moves forward in a very natural, linear way, but the emotional depth keeps increasing with each new scene. The excitement of George's new abilities quickly turns into confusion and concern for the people around him. Instead of being celebrated, George finds himself slowly isolated. Friends who once shared laughs with him now whisper behind his back. Some start to believe that George is dangerous, or that something supernatural is happening that they should fear. The very people who once cared for him begin to pull away. The film gently explores how society often rejects what it doesn't understand. George's growing intelligence doesn't bring him closer to his community. It drives a wedge between them. One of the most interesting turning points comes when scientists and doctors step in, curious to study George and figure out what's happening to him. There's also government interest, and soon George finds himself trapped between people who fear him and people who want to control him. But through it all, George remains focused on trying to help others. He uses his new knowledge to solve problems, to try and make life better for those around him, even if they're not ready to accept his help. He doesn't seek fame or fortune. He simply wants to do good. His relationship with Lace becomes the emotional core of the story. Lace is a guarded, cautious woman who has built walls around herself after facing her own hardships. She is one of the few people who still sees George as a man and not a phenomenon. Their connection slowly deepens, and through their growing relationship, we see George's most human side. He's vulnerable, kind, and deeply in love, despite the growing weight of his situation. The way their bond develops, despite all the challenges, is both heartwarming and bittersweet. The film keeps building its emotional intensity as it reveals that George's extraordinary abilities are not a permanent gift, but a symptom of something much more serious. The true reason behind his transformation is not supernatural at all. It's linked to a rare medical condition that is changing his brain in ways science can't fully understand. This revelation flips the story on its head. What seemed like a miracle is actually a countdown. George's time is limited, and suddenly, all his abilities are painted with a layer of sadness. The very thing that made him extraordinary is also what will ultimately take him away. The narrative never rushes. It gives time for quiet, meaningful moments. Scenes where George fixes a radio, where he teaches a child, where he sits under the stars. All of these moments carry weight because we know what's coming. The story asks powerful questions about how we treat people who are different, how we deal with things we can't explain, and what it truly means to live a meaningful life. There's no trickery with time. The story unfolds step by step, in a linear way, but the emotional turns and surprises keep the audience fully engaged. The conflicts are not between heroes and villains, but between acceptance and fear, between connection and isolation. The story is not about a man who gains powers. It's about a man who is given a brief, brilliant light, and how he chooses to use it. Throughout the film, George remains someone who tries to give more than he takes, who wants to understand and love, even as the world struggles to understand him. The narrative becomes a reflection of what it means to be human. It celebrates curiosity, kindness, and courage in the face of the unknown. The story doesn't rely on big action sequences or complicated structures. It's powerful because it is simple and deeply honest. It captures the beauty and fragility of life in a way that sticks with you long after the story ends. In Phenomenon 1996, what truly makes the story unforgettable is not just the plot or the miraculous event that sparks George Malley's transformation, but the rich, layered development of the characters and how they grow, change, and respond to each other throughout the film. Each character is carefully written with depth and humanity, and their personal journeys add emotional weight to every moment. At the center of it all is George Malley, a character who starts as someone utterly ordinary, living a life that feels small, predictable, and comfortable. George is not a genius, not a hero, not a man chasing success. He's simply a good person, liked by his friends and quietly in love with a woman who has built walls around her heart. The beauty of George's character is that his transformation never changes the core of who he is. Even when his mind begins to expand at an incredible pace, he remains soft-spoken, humble, and endlessly curious. He doesn't crave attention or use his intelligence to control or outsmart people. Instead, George is driven by a desire to understand the world, to help others, and to stay connected to his simple life. His growth is not about gaining power, it's about learning what truly matters. As his abilities grow, George becomes more aware of the emotional distance forming between himself and the people he loves. He faces rejection, fear, and misunderstanding, but rather than turning bitter or isolated, he keeps reaching out, trying to bring people closer. His personal journey is about acceptance, not just of his newfound abilities, but of his own mortality. The moment he realizes his condition is not a gift, but a sign that his life is coming to an end is quietly devastating. But even in that, George never loses his dignity or his compassion. He chooses to focus on what little time he has left and to fill it with love, kindness, and meaningful connection. His arc is one of the most quietly powerful character transformations, because it never seeks grand gestures. It is about the small, beautiful choices that make a life worthwhile. Lace, the woman George is drawn to, is equally complex. When we first meet her, Lace is guarded and distant, someone who has experienced pain and has chosen to build a protective shell around herself. She doesn't trust easily, and she certainly doesn't open her heart quickly. Her journey is one of learning how to let love back into her life. Lace is not written as a simple love interest. She has her own struggles, her own fears, and her own emotional history that shape her every decision. At first, she keeps George at arm's length, unsure of what to make of his feelings for her or of his growing fame in the town. But as she spends more time with him, she sees beyond his intelligence and his new abilities. She starts to see the gentle, sincere man who cares for her children, who respects her space, who never pressures her. Through George, Lace begins to heal. Her transformation is quiet but deeply moving as she shifts from fear and hesitation to acceptance and deep love. She doesn't fall for George because he's extraordinary. She falls for him because he's patient, kind, and real. George's best friend, Nate, is one of the most essential emotional anchors in the film. Nate is the kind of friend everyone hopes to have. Loyal, funny, honest, and always present. Nate's journey is not just about supporting George. It's about learning to accept what he cannot understand. Nate struggles with George's sudden transformation. There are moments where he feels left behind, moments where he doubts, moments where he simply cannot grasp what is happening to his friend. But even when confusion sets in, Nate never truly abandons George. His loyalty and his fierce protection of their friendship give the story its most heartfelt and grounded moments. Nate represents that beautiful kind of friend who might not always have the right words, but will always be there when it matters. Watching their friendship survive the strain of George's growing difference is one of the most touching elements of the film. The townspeople play a fascinating role as a collective character. Their response to George's transformation is a reflection of human nature. They begin with curiosity and fascination, but that quickly shifts to fear, suspicion, and eventually rejection. They see George's intelligence as something unnatural, something dangerous. The town's slow turn against him is not driven by hatred, but by confusion and fear of the unknown. It's a subtle but powerful commentary on how communities often deal with people who don't fit into their expectations. Instead of trying to understand George, they push him away. Their reaction brings out one of the most painful realities. Sometimes the place that once felt like home can become the place that hurts you the most. The emotional distance between George and his town is not created by what George does, but by how quickly people let fear replace friendship. Even the secondary characters are written with layers. The local doctor, for example, initially approaches George's condition with clinical skepticism. He wants to label it, measure it, control it. But as the story progresses, the doctor becomes one of the few people who genuinely seeks to understand George, not just as a subject but as a person. His quiet shift from scientific detachment to human empathy adds a thoughtful layer to the story. He begins to see George not as a medical mystery, but as a man facing something extraordinary and heartbreaking. George's relationships with children in the town are another beautiful detail. Children are the ones who continue to see George as a friend, a mentor, and someone magical in the best sense of the word. They aren't burdened by fear or social pressure, and their pure acceptance of George serves as a gentle contrast to the adults who have grown too cautious and suspicious. Through his interactions with the children, we see George's natural warmth and patience, his ability to teach, and his genuine desire to make life a little better for others. Each character's growth is woven carefully into the narrative. No one remains static. Lace learns to love again. Nate learns to stand by his friend even when he doesn't understand him. The doctor learns to see beyond science. The townspeople learn the painful lesson of what happens when fear drives people apart. And George, at the heart of it all, learns that the most extraordinary thing about life is not knowledge or power. It's connection, it's love, it's leaving behind something good in the hearts of others. The film doesn't rush these character arcs. It gives them space to breathe, to evolve naturally, and to touch the audience in a way that feels real and lasting. By the end, you don't just remember what happened in the story. You remember who these people were, how they changed, how they struggled, and how their lives were forever shaped by one man who, for a brief moment, became something more. Their stories stay with you long after the final scene, not because of big twists or dramatic speeches, but because of the quiet, honest ways they grow. In Phenomenon 1996, The performances are not just a part of the story. They are the foundation that makes the film resonate on such a deep emotional level. Every actor in this film brings something genuine and textured to their role, creating characters who feel fully alive, completely real, and quietly unforgettable. The power of the movie comes from these performances that feel honest, carefully measured, and emotionally rich. They don't rely on big, dramatic outbursts or exaggerated emotions. Instead, they rely on subtlety, on the quiet spaces between words, on looks, pauses, hesitations, and the very human ways people express love, fear, loyalty, and confusion. Jon Travolta's portrayal of George Malley is a masterclass in restraint. Travolta, who is often remembered for his charisma and energetic screen presence, does something very different here. He strips all of that away to reveal a man who is simple, kind, curious, and vulnerable. Travolta doesn't play George like a man thrilled by his newfound powers. He plays him as someone who is quietly trying to understand what is happening to him, while holding on to the ordinary life he loves. What makes Travolta's performance extraordinary is how grounded it remains. George's intelligence begins to soar, his memory sharpens, he learns languages in moments, he solves complex problems effortlessly, but Travolta never lets him drift into arrogance or detachment. Instead, his George is someone who is deeply aware that he is becoming different, and that this difference might cost him everything. There's a beautiful honesty in the way Travolta shows George's confusion and sadness. His eyes carry the weight of someone who desperately wants to stay connected to his friends and to the woman he loves, even as they begin to look at him like a stranger. The audience never sees him chasing glory or recognition. His brilliance almost seems like a burden he didn't ask for, and Travolta carefully shows this internal struggle. Every time George is rejected by the people around him, you can see the subtle crack in his smile, the tiny drop in his shoulders, the way he tries to shake it off and move forward. These details make his performance so authentic. Even in the final moments, when George realizes his life is coming to an end, Travolta plays him with quiet grace. There is no big breakdown, no screaming, no demand for pity, just a soft acceptance and a gentle focus on what matters most: love, friendship, and leaving behind a little good in the world. Kyra Sedgwick's performance as Lace is equally rich and carefully constructed. Lace is not written as a perfect character. She is guarded, cautious, and carries the weight of past emotional wounds that have made her wary of getting too close to anyone. Sedgwick plays this with incredible subtlety. In the beginning, Lace seems cold, distant, maybe even a little standoffish, but Sedgwick doesn't make her feel unkind. Instead, she gives Lace a quiet sadness, a kind of invisible armor that slowly starts to crack as she spends more time with George. One of the most impressive things about Sedgwick's performance is how slowly and naturally she allows Lace to soften. It never feels rushed or forced. Her hesitation is always visible. She's a woman who wants to trust, who wants to love, but who is terrified of losing again. The audience watches her shift in small moments. The way she starts to make longer eye contact with George, the way she lets her guard down around her children, the way her body begins to relax when she's with him. Sedgwick doesn't rely on big speeches or grand gestures to show Lace's transformation. Instead, she fills her performance with quiet decisions. A soft smile when George makes her laugh, a lingering glance when he says something kind, a slight lean toward him when she begins to trust him. When Lace finally falls in love with George, it feels fully earned because Sedgwick has made the audience walk through every step of that emotional journey with her. Her performance gives the love story depth and makes it something the audience can feel, not just watch. Robert Duvall, playing the town doctor, is one of the film's most quietly powerful presences. Duvall has a way of filling silence with meaning. His character starts off as someone who is trying to understand George's condition through the lens of science and logic. But what makes Duvall's performance special is the way he allows his character's clinical detachment to slowly evolve into personal connection. The doctor is not just there to explain George's medical reality. He becomes someone who genuinely cares, who feels the weight of what is happening to his patient and his friend. Duvall's steady, thoughtful delivery adds a sense of calm to the film. He is the character who never panics, who doesn't give in to fear or superstition. And his quiet support of George in the later parts of the film gives the story an added layer of tenderness. Duvall knows when to speak and, more importantly, when to simply listen. His performance is a reminder that sometimes the greatest act of kindness is to sit with someone and truly hear them. Forest Whitaker's performance as Nate is one of the emotional anchors of the film. Nate is more than just the best friend. He is George's chosen family. Whitaker brings to Nate a perfect mix of loyalty, humor, confusion, and deep, unwavering love. Whitaker's ability to show Nate's emotional complexity without overplaying any moment is what makes his performance so moving. Nate doesn't always understand what is happening to George, and he doesn't pretend to. There are moments when Nate is visibly struggling to keep up with his friend's rapid transformation. He's sometimes frustrated, sometimes overwhelmed, but he never pulls away. Whitaker beautifully plays Nate as a man who might not have the answers, but knows that the most important thing he can do is to stand by his friend. His laughter, his puzzled expressions, his sudden bursts of protective anger, all feel completely real and come from a place of deep care. The chemistry between Whitaker and Travolta is natural and believable. Their friendship feels lived in, full of the kind of comfortable teasing and wordless understanding that comes from years of trust. When Nate finally confronts the reality that he may lose his best friend, Whitaker delivers those scenes with heartbreaking simplicity. He doesn't try to deliver a perfect goodbye. He just stays close, offering whatever support he can in the time that's left. The supporting cast, including the people in the town, plays a subtle but critical role in the story's emotional build. These characters don't have grand monologues or complex story arcs, but their shifting reactions to George help create the film's social tension. In the beginning, the townspeople are friendly, curious, and welcoming. But as George's abilities grow, their nervous glances, their quiet conversations behind his back, and their eventual distance from him all feel painfully real. The actors playing these smaller roles never turn the town into a villainous mob. Instead, they present a believable picture of how fear can quietly grow in a community, not through hatred but through hesitation, uncertainty, and the instinct to pull away from what you can't understand. What ties all of these performances together is their quietness, their natural rhythm, and their refusal to become melodramatic. The cast understands that Phenomenon is a story about ordinary people facing something extraordinary. Let's take a deeper dive into the direction of Phenomenon, 1996, because what Jon Turteltaub does in this film is truly remarkable in its quiet sophistication. His choices may seem simple on the surface, but the more you watch, the more you realize how carefully crafted every moment is. Turteltaub doesn't treat this as a typical science fiction story or even as a dramatic romance. He frames it as a deeply human experience wrapped in something extraordinary. And that's what makes the film feel so personal, warm, and emotionally rich. One of the first things you notice about Turteltaub's direction is his absolute respect for silence and stillness. In most films dealing with miraculous abilities or supernatural changes, the camera would constantly be moving, the pacing would be tight, and the editing would cut quickly to emphasize the power or the spectacle. But Turteltaub does the opposite. He lets the story breathe. He holds the camera still. He gives the actors time to react. And it's in those unspoken, quiet beats that the film finds its deepest truths. The pauses are not wasted space. They're essential moments where characters are thinking, feeling, and processing in real time, and the audience is given permission to simply sit with them. Turteltaub's pacing is intentionally unhurried. He's not racing to get to the next plot point or action beat. Instead, he moves through the story at the pace of life. Scenes unfold like conversations you might have in your own kitchen, or on a quiet walk down a familiar road. There's a rhythm to this town, to George's life, that feels real, and Turteltaub protects that rhythm even as George's world begins to change. He doesn't rush the transformation. He allows George's discovery of his abilities to unfold with curiosity, wonder, and just the right touch of disbelief. The magic isn't treated like a spectacle. It's treated like a mystery George is gently trying to solve. And the audience is invited to solve it alongside him, step by step, without being pulled ahead by forced drama. Visually, Turteltaub's choices are beautifully subtle. He frames the town with warmth, using soft, natural lighting and wide, open shots that make it feel expansive yet cozy. You can feel the dust in the air, the late afternoon sunlight hitting the local shop windows, the comforting smallness of a place where everyone knows your name. This isn't just a setting, It's a character in the film, and Turteltaub's attention to the details of this world makes it feel alive. But as George's powers grow and the town's trust begins to fracture, Turteltaub quietly adjusts the visuals. He doesn't need to announce the shift. He simply begins to frame George at more of a distance. He lets the warm, golden tones cool just a little. He allows the town to subtly feel less welcoming, less safe, without ever needing to say it out loud. His direction also shines in the way he visually captures George's isolation. George begins the film surrounded by people, friends, neighbors, familiar faces at every turn. But as the story progresses, Turteltaub carefully starts to position George alone in the frame. The physical distance between George and the people he loves grows just as their emotional distance grows. There's a quiet ache in those shots where George stands in an open space, alone, as the others watch him from the sidelines. It's a simple technique, but it speaks volumes about his growing loneliness and the emotional cost of being different. Turteltaub also makes excellent use of sound, or sometimes the lack of it. There are no loud, aggressive sound cues to tell the audience how to feel. Instead, the sound design is soft, almost invisible, allowing the natural sounds of life, a breeze, footsteps, the creak of a chair, to fill the space. Even in moments where George demonstrates his abilities, like moving objects with his mind, the sound is not exaggerated. There's no thunderous musical score to make the moment feel bigger. Turteltaub treats these events as quiet miracles, not grand spectacles. This choice keeps the film grounded and ensures that George's abilities don't overshadow his humanity. Another strength in Turteltaub's direction is how he handles the film's emotional transitions. The love story between George and Lace unfolds with an almost delicate patience. In many films, this kind of romance would rush toward grand gestures and emotional confessions. But here, Turteltaub keeps everything small, honest, and rooted in the reality of who these two people are. He doesn't rely on big romantic speeches. Instead, he focuses on the small gestures, a glance, a touch, a quiet moment of shared laughter, that build intimacy over time. When Lace finally opens her heart to George, it doesn't feel like a plot requirement. It feels like something hard-earned, something deeply real. The same care applies to George's friendships, especially with Nate and the town doctor. Turteltaub directs these relationships with such subtlety that you feel like you're watching real people, not characters following a script. He captures the little things. The way Nate and George share long-standing jokes, the way the doctor's concern is visible in his hesitant pauses, the way friendships sometimes don't need words to communicate understanding. These relationships are the heartbeat of the film, and Turteltaub gives them space to grow naturally, without forcing artificial drama. His handling of conflict is particularly impressive because he avoids easy villains. The townspeople who pull away from George aren't portrayed as cruel or hateful. Turteltaub directs them as people who are scared, confused, and unsure of what to believe. This makes the story more complex and the emotional fallout more painful. It's not a story about good versus evil. It's a story about fear, about the fragility of human connection, and about how quickly people can distance themselves from what they don't understand. Turteltaub's direction embraces this complexity instead of simplifying it. Even as the story approaches its most heartbreaking moments, Turteltaub refuses to tip the film into melodrama. George's decline is handled with extraordinary restraint. There are no big, overacted deathbed scenes. There's no forced desperation. Instead, George faces his fate with quiet acceptance, and Turteltaub directs those final scenes with a kind of gentle reverence. The camera lingers just long enough to capture the weight of the moment, but never overstays. The final choices George makes, choosing to spend his last days surrounded by love, choosing to leave quietly rather than becoming a public phenomenon, are presented with a softness that lingers in the mind long after the credits roll. What makes Turteltaub's direction and phenomenon so memorable is that he constantly chooses the understated path. He trusts the story, the actors, and the audience. He doesn't push. He guides. He shapes the narrative with a calm hand, allowing the beauty of the small moments to shine. His direction proves that sometimes the most powerful stories don't need loud visuals or fast pacing. Sometimes all they need is patience, honesty, and a deep respect for the quiet beauty of ordinary life touched by something extraordinary. Let's dive even deeper into the cinematography of Phenomenon, 1996, because what Fed and Papa Michael does with the camera is not just about capturing the story. It's about creating a visual heartbeat that perfectly matches the film's emotional rhythm. His cinematography doesn't demand attention, but the more you watch, the more you realize how carefully every frame has been chosen to quietly shape the way you feel about George, his journey, and his place in the world. From the very beginning, the visual language is soft, welcoming, and deeply rooted in naturalism. The town is bathed in sunlight, but it's not a cinematic, overpolished light. It feels like real light, the kind that filters through trees in the afternoon, the kind that makes dust motes visible when they hang in the air, the kind that warms the side of an old shop's window pane. This isn't just pretty lighting, it's lighting with intention. Papa Michael uses these warm tones to build a sense of comfort and familiarity. You can feel the heat of the pavement, the coolness of the breeze on a porch, the quiet of early morning when the town is still waking up. This creates a visual space where George feels at home, where life feels steady and safe, and where nothing seems extraordinary. But the brilliance of Papa Michael's work is how this visual comfort slowly starts to shift as George changes. He doesn't turn the town dark or overtly threatening. He simply starts to remove some of that cozy, golden light. Scenes that once glowed with warmth become a little flatter, a little more muted. The shift is so subtle you might not notice it at first, but emotionally, you feel the difference. It's as if the sunlight is fading from George's world. And that absence tells us so much about how his relationships and his place in the town are quietly unraveling. The way Papa Michael frames George is also crucial. Early on, George is almost always centered in the frame, surrounded by people, tucked into the busy life of the town. There's a physical closeness, not just in the way the characters interact but in the way the camera brings them together within the shot. The town feels like it wraps itself around George. But as George's intelligence and powers grow, the framing begins to change. Papa Michael starts placing George off-center, sometimes isolating him with large amounts of empty space around him. These visual gaps become louder as the story progresses. Even when George is in a crowd, the camera sometimes makes him look like he's standing apart from everyone else. This isolation becomes one of the quiet visual threads running through the film. The more extraordinary George becomes, the more the camera places him in spaces that visually remind us of his growing loneliness. Camera movement is another tool Papa Michael uses with precision. He doesn't go for the kind of fast, kinetic shots you might expect in a story about supernatural abilities. Instead, the camera moves with a gentle, almost observational pace. It glides instead of jerks. It lingers instead of rushing. This gives the entire film a sense of calm, even in moments of tension. When George demonstrates his telekinetic abilities, the camera doesn't dramatically zoom in or whip around him. It stays steady, as if saying that what's important isn't the spectacle of what he can do, but how those around him are reacting, and more importantly, how he feels about it. The power is not the focus, the humanity is. There's a particular restraint in how Papa Michael chooses when to move the camera, and when to let it sit still. In conversations between George and Lace, for example, the camera often holds quietly on their faces, giving their silences just as much weight as their words. It's in these moments, when nothing is being said, that the cinematography does its most powerful work. The slight shifts in lighting, the way the background softly blurs, the way the characters are framed to either lean into or away from each other. It's all visual storytelling that builds their connection without needing to verbalize every emotion. The natural environments in the film play an essential role, and Papa Michael captures them with a quiet reverence. The fields, the trees, the long winding roads, they are filmed with a softness that makes them feel like extensions of George himself. When George walks through these spaces, the camera often pulls back just enough to show him moving alone through wide, open landscapes. These shots carry a beautiful duality. They are peaceful, yet they subtly remind us of George's increasing distance from the people who can't understand him. Nature becomes his refuge, the one place where he isn't being questioned, feared, or watched with suspicion. One of the most emotionally significant visual motifs in the film is the use of sky and space. Papa Michael repeatedly frames George against big open skies, during the day, under the stars, even when he's simply looking out from a distance. The sky represents something vast and unknowable, something beyond George's reach, but also something that now seems connected to him. The stars in particular become a quiet companion to George's journey, hinting at the idea that his story is part of something much larger than himself. These wide shots create a sense of both wonder and insignificance. George has touched something extraordinary, but he's still just one man under the sky, trying to live his life. Interior spaces also evolve visually as George's story unfolds. The local bar, the repair shop, Lace's house. These settings start off feeling lived in and familiar, with warm, low lighting and plenty of visual clutter that makes them feel real. But as George's abilities separate him from the people he loves, Papa Michael begins to frame these spaces differently. There's more distance between characters. The lighting becomes less inviting. Shadows creep in just a little more. The rooms feel bigger, emptier, even if nothing physical has changed. It's a subtle shift, but it carefully mirrors George's emotional journey from connection to isolation. The way George's physical decline is captured is another quiet triumph of the cinematography. Papa Michael doesn't rely on heavy visual signals to tell us that George is getting weaker. Instead, he lets the spaces around George tell the story. George begins to sit more, to slow down, to be surrounded by stillness. The camera mirrors this by lingering longer, moving less, and framing him in ways that gently emphasize his frailty without turning him into a visual spectacle. It's respectful. It's tender. It's visually honest. The use of natural light throughout the film also speaks to the cinematography's dedication to grounding this extraordinary story in the real world. There's no overuse of artificial lighting. The film embraces the imperfections of daylight and shadow. Morning scenes are bright but soft. Evening scenes take on a quiet golden hue that feels like the end of a long, thoughtful day. Even night scenes are lit in a way that feels authentic, dim, cool, with just enough visibility to let the audience feel present, but not artificially spotlighted. This visual honesty keeps the entire story feeling relatable, even as George's experiences become otherworldly. The cinematography in Phenomenon does something rare. It builds visual poetry out of the ordinary. It invites the audience to look closely, to notice the way light falls across a face, to feel the weight of silence, to see the quiet ache in an empty chair. Let's take an even deeper dive into the editing and pacing of Phenomenon 1996, because this aspect of the film's construction is not just about how scenes are stitched together. It's about how the rhythm of the film carefully mirrors the emotional heartbeat of its main character, George Malley. What editor Andrew Monshine does here is remarkably delicate. He creates a steady, flowing pace that quietly guides the audience through the film without ever pulling them out of the emotional space George is living in. It's the kind of editing that you don't overtly notice on first viewing, because it's so seamlessly aligned with the story, but it's actually doing an incredible amount of work in shaping the emotional experience. From the very first scene, the film's rhythm establishes itself as patient and grounded. We're introduced to George's world not with quick cuts or overly energetic setups, but with long, easy takes that gently invite the audience into this small-town life. The pacing here feels like the natural pace of life in a place where everyone knows each other, where conversations linger, where people don't feel the need to rush. Monshine chooses to let these scenes unfold without slicing them into tiny fragments. He respects the silences, the spaces between words, the moments where the camera simply holds on a character's face. This creates a sense of real time, a feeling that we are walking through the day alongside George, not skipping ahead to get to the good parts. That pacing is critical because it gives us time to invest emotionally in George before anything supernatural happens. In many films with extraordinary plot twists, the story can be in a hurry to reach the big, flashy moment. But here, the editing understands that the real power of the story lies in how deeply we care about George as a person first. The film doesn't rush to show us his transformation because it knows the transformation means more if we've been living in George's ordinary world long enough to feel what he stands to lose. The early pacing is slow, but it's intentionally slow. It's teaching us to observe, to listen, to care. When the flash of light hits George, and his mind begins to evolve, the film could have easily shifted gears into a faster, more kinetic editing style to signal the change. But Monshine does something far more subtle and emotionally intelligent. He keeps the pacing consistent. The story's rhythm doesn't suddenly accelerate because George's life doesn't suddenly feel like an action film. It feels like the same life he's always lived, just now with a strange new awareness. This choice keeps the audience anchored in George's perspective. It doesn't become a film about power. It remains a film about curiosity, about connection, about the quiet weight of change. As George's abilities grow, the editing becomes a key tool in showing how the people around him begin to perceive him differently. The pacing in these moments is not about building tension in the traditional sense. It's about creating space for those subtle shifts in the way characters interact with him. Mondschein often allows entire conversations to play out without cutting away, which makes the growing distance between George and his community feel all the more real. The editing doesn't cut to reactions quickly. It lingers, letting those silences stretch, making the discomfort and the confusion palpable. These long, unhurried takes give the audience time to sit with the weight of what's happening. There's a careful patience in the way the editing handles George's learning process. When he's devouring books, discovering new knowledge, and realizing the full extent of his abilities, the film never rushes through these moments with montage sequences that would condense his growth into a few seconds. Instead, the pacing respects the gravity of what he's going through. His thirst for knowledge feels authentic because we're allowed to sit with him through the long hours, the late nights, the quiet, concentrated moments. Mondschein edits these sequences to emphasize not speed, but depth. This is not about how fast George can learn, but how deeply he is changing. When the narrative starts introducing conflict, when the townspeople begin to fear him, when George's body begins to betray him, the editing subtly shifts. The scenes become shorter. The story's rhythm begins to tighten, not because the film is suddenly shifting into a thriller, but because George's world is closing in on him. The emotional pressure builds, and the editing gently reflects that by trimming away the spaciousness we experienced earlier, there's less room to breathe now. Scenes that once unfolded slowly now feel like they're moving toward inevitable emotional collisions. This shift is so well calibrated that it doesn't feel abrupt. It feels like a natural evolution of the story's pulse. Mondschein also makes incredibly thoughtful choices in moments of emotional intimacy. The editing in George and Lace's scenes is a prime example of this. Their relationship develops in these quiet, almost fragile moments where the camera lingers, where cuts between them are soft and purposeful. The pacing of their relationship is slow, deliberately avoiding the usual cinematic shortcuts that rush two characters into love. Instead, the editing lets us feel the weight of their hesitation, their fear, their cautious steps toward each other. When their connection finally deepens, it feels fully earned, because the film has given us time to live inside their shared moments. Even in scenes where George is displaying his telekinetic abilities or performing incredible feats of intelligence, the editing refuses to turn the film into a spectacle. Mondschein often holds the shot longer than you would expect, choosing to focus not on the flashy action but on George's expression, on the quiet awe or confusion of the people watching him. The power of these moments isn't in the trick, it's in the emotional ripple that follows. By avoiding rapid cutting in these scenes, the film keeps its focus squarely on the human story. The progression toward the film's final act is handled with tremendous care. As George's illness progresses, the editing becomes more intimate, more contemplative. Scenes slow down again. The film begins to return to the unhurried pacing we saw at the beginning, as if closing the emotional loop. The story started slowly, it gained urgency, and now it's gently settling into reflection. The editing allows the audience to sit with George's quiet acceptance, to feel the bittersweet weight of the time he has left. There are no rushed farewells, no quick emotional payoffs. The story breathes all the way to the end. One of the most beautiful aspects of the film's pacing is that it allows the audience to feel like they've truly spent time with these characters. You don't feel like you've been sped through a series of plot points. You feel like you've walked through days, through conversations, through silences, through struggles and discoveries. The editing trusts the audience to be patient, to find meaning in the pauses, to absorb the emotions that live between words. Even the film's final moments resist the temptation to wrap things up too quickly. The editing lets the final images linger just long enough to let the story's emotional resonance settle in. It's a quiet, respectful farewell, not just to George, but to the experience of walking alongside him. The pacing slows to a near standstill, allowing the audience to hold onto the story for just a few extra beats before it gently fades away. Let's dive even further into the soundtrack and score of Phenomenon, 1996, because the music here is not just an accessory. It is a carefully woven emotional framework that silently guides the audience through George Malley's unique and touching journey. Thomas Newman's work in this film is a masterclass in musical restraint and emotional precision. His compositions are never loud, never overwhelming, but always profoundly in tune with the heartbeat of the story. It's the kind of soundtrack that doesn't just support the film, it lives within it. What makes Newman's score so special is its ability to blend seamlessly into the texture of George's world. The small-town setting, the simplicity of everyday life, the quiet wonder of personal discovery, all of this is reflected in the music. Newman doesn't come in with big, sweeping orchestral gestures. Instead, he uses delicate piano melodies, subtle string arrangements, and occasional soft acoustic guitar to create a sound that feels honest, personal, and emotionally close. The score feels like the musical equivalent of George himself, unassuming on the surface, but quietly extraordinary underneath. In the opening moments of the film, before anything unusual happens, the music establishes a tone of warmth and simplicity. It moves at a gentle pace, mirroring the easy rhythm of life in George's town. The melodies feel like they're drifting along with the summer breeze, giving the audience a sense of comfort and familiarity. There's no tension, no urgency, just a quiet invitation to settle into George's world. Newman's use of soft piano and light strings in these early scenes creates a musical atmosphere that feels like home. It's this musical foundation that makes George's later transformation so impactful. Because we've been anchored in the ordinary, we fully appreciate how extraordinary his experience becomes. When the mysterious flash of light changes George's life, the music could have shifted dramatically, but Newman makes a brilliant choice. He doesn't fill the scene with booming, otherworldly sounds. Instead, he introduces subtle shimmering textures, small, bright musical accents that feel like they're dancing around the edges of the frame. The music captures a sense of curiosity and wonder, but it never feels forced or artificial. It's as if the score is discovering these new abilities at the same pace George is. The music doesn't tell the audience, "This is amazing." It simply invites us to feel that amazement for ourselves. One of the standout qualities of Newman's score is how deeply it respects the emotional spaces of the film. When George starts to explore his newfound intelligence, when he begins to solve complex problems, move objects with his mind, and display abilities that defy explanation, the music could have easily leaned into grand, cinematic statements. But Newman consistently chooses intimacy over spectacle. The score remains soft, contemplative, almost hesitant. It's as if the music is reminding us that this story isn't about power, it's about what it means to be human. In scenes where George's abilities are on display, Newman's music carefully avoids falling into the rhythm of a traditional power moment. There's no swelling brass, no heroic theme to signal George's greatness. Instead, we get gentle piano arpeggios, softly layered strings, and delicate, sparkling motifs that suggest wonder without making it feel like a performance. The music keeps the focus on George's emotional experience, not the spectacle of what he can do. When George begins to realize that his condition is more than just a mysterious gift, that it's actually a sign of something far more tragic, the score shifts in a way that's almost imperceptible at first. The melodies become more introspective. The spaces between the notes grow longer. The music begins to breathe more deeply, giving weight to George's quiet sadness and growing acceptance. Newman doesn't hit the audience with heavy-handed emotional cues. Instead, he carefully underlines the emotional shifts with music that feels natural and truthful. There's a sense of dignity in the way the score handles George's decline. It never becomes manipulative or melodramatic. It stays honest, soft, and quietly heartbreaking. The score also plays an essential role in shaping the relationship between George and Lace. Their love story unfolds in moments that are as much about silence and hesitation as they are about spoken words. Newman's music in these scenes is beautifully restrained. It lingers softly in the background, allowing the chemistry between the characters to shine. The gentle acoustic guitar themes that thread through their shared moments are warm, tender, and never rushed. There's a patience in the music that perfectly mirrors the way George and Lace cautiously approach each other, slowly building trust and connection. One of the most remarkable aspects of the soundtrack is how it handles silence. Thomas Newman is not afraid to let the music step aside completely when a moment needs to stand on its own. There are pivotal scenes. George confronting the townspeople, quiet reflections under the night sky, conversations where emotions hang thick in the air, where the absence of music becomes just as powerful as the score itself. This thoughtful use of silence amplifies the weight of the moment, allowing the rawness of the performances and the depth of the story to fully resonate. When the music does return after these silences, it feels like a soft re-entry, like a gentle hand on the shoulder. The score never rushes back in with urgency. It floats in, almost as if it's been waiting quietly in the background, ready to support the story without overpowering it. This ebb and flow between music and silence creates a beautifully organic rhythm throughout the film, giving the audience space to process the story's emotional beats. As the film approaches its final act, when George's time is clearly slipping away, the score grows more contemplative and even more fragile. The melodies slow, the harmonies deepen, and the music begins to carry a subtle sense of farewell. Newman introduces slightly darker, more resonant tones here, but even in these moments, the music remains gentle. It's never about tragedy. It's about acceptance, about love, about quietly saying goodbye. The score seems to wrap around George like a comforting embrace, guiding the audience through the inevitable with grace and compassion. In the final scenes, Newman's music carefully mirrors the story's return to stillness. Where the film began with soft, flowing melodies that captured the peaceful rhythm of George's life, it ends with a similarly gentle musical presence. There's no grand emotional finale, just a quiet, lingering farewell that feels deeply personal. The closing music leaves the audience with a sense of peace rather than sorrow, a final gift that echoes George's own acceptance and understanding. Throughout the entire film, the soundtrack and score never attempt to dominate. They never tell the audience what to feel. They simply provide a space where those feelings can unfold naturally. Thomas Newman's music is the emotional thread that connects every part of George's journey, from the ordinary to the extraordinary, from discovery to heartbreak to peace. The genius of Newman's approach lies in his ability to make the music feel as if it's part of the fabric of George's life, not an external addition. Let's explore the themes and messages of Phenomenon, 1996, in even deeper, more nuanced layers because this is not a film that simply tells a story. It gently opens doors to some of life's biggest questions and allows the audience to walk through them at their own pace. The film's themes operate like overlapping waves, each carrying its own quiet weight, each inviting the viewer to reflect, wonder, and feel. The film's central theme, the awakening of human potential, is presented not as a fantasy but as a beautiful, almost spiritual possibility. George Malley doesn't become extraordinary by chasing power or seeking greatness. His transformation is accidental, unplanned, and yet it opens his mind in ways that most people can only dream of. It forces the viewer to question the limits we place on ourselves, and to think about how much more we could achieve if we simply dared to ask, dared to wonder, dared to learn. The film never shouts this message. It whispers it, through George's insatiable curiosity and his gentle willingness to explore. It's as though the story is saying, perhaps the only thing separating us from our own extraordinary selves is the courage to open our minds. But the film doesn't just celebrate knowledge. It carefully shows how knowledge without understanding, without human connection, can be isolating. As George's intelligence expands, he becomes an outsider in his own town. His neighbors, people who once greeted him with warm smiles and casual conversations, now look at him with suspicion, confusion, and even fear. This beautifully illustrates the theme of societal resistance to the unknown. Humans are often deeply uncomfortable with things that don't fit their version of the world. The more George learns, the more distant he becomes from those around him. His mind grows, but his relationships shrink. And in that contrast, the film gently asks whether we truly celebrate intelligence and discovery, or whether we only do so when it feels safe, familiar, and within our control. There's also a profound exploration of fear, both personal and communal. The townspeople's growing unease about George isn't born out of logic. It's born out of the primal fear of what they don't understand. This fear is quiet at first, a glance, a hesitation, a question left unanswered. But it grows into something that slowly pushes George to the margins of his own life. The story never paints the townspeople as villains. It presents them as ordinary people caught in a moment where their comfort zone is shattered. This exploration of fear becomes a powerful reflection of how humans instinctively build walls around what feels strange or uncontrollable, often isolating those who are different in the process. One of the most moving themes in the film is the delicate balance between control and fate. George didn't choose to be struck by the mysterious light, and he certainly didn't choose the tumor that would ultimately cut his life short. The story could have easily become about George fighting against his fate, searching for a cure, or refusing to accept his destiny. But instead, the film gently steers him toward acceptance. George learns to live within the time he has, to find meaning not in how much time he gets, but in what he does with that time. It's a subtle but deeply powerful message, that sometimes, we cannot control the cards we are dealt, but we can control how we play them. George's calm acceptance of his condition, his choice to continue loving, learning, and giving even as his life shortens, speaks to a quiet courage that doesn't need grand speeches or dramatic sacrifices. It's a reminder that true strength often looks like quiet dignity. The theme of love is beautifully threaded throughout the film, and it's love in all its forms: romantic love, friendship, community, and self-love. George's connection with Lace is tender and patient, unfolding not in fireworks but in cautious steps. Their relationship doesn't explode into passion. It grows like a plant, carefully watered, quietly nurtured. There is fear in Lace, hesitation in George, but there is also undeniable warmth. Their love is built on trust, on the slow peeling back of layers, on the vulnerability of being fully seen. The story reminds us that love doesn't always arrive as a storm. It can also come as a soft rain, as a shared silence, as a simple act of being there. His friendships with Nate and Doc are also beautifully crafted. They offer a picture of loyalty that doesn't waver, even when the rest of the town begins to pull away. These relationships become George's anchor. They show that sometimes, it's not the number of people who support you that matters. It's the depth of the few who stand by you. Perhaps one of the most quietly brilliant aspects of Phenomenon is its exploration of life's simplicity. The film doesn't chase high-stakes drama or overcomplicate its story. Instead, it celebrates the small things: the pull of a ripe apple, the joy of learning a new language, the comfort of a familiar routine, the quiet of a starlit sky. It seems to gently suggest that we often look for meaning in grand achievements, in big moments, but maybe life's real magic lives in the ordinary, in the everyday details we so often overlook. George's intellectual awakening doesn't separate him from the beauty of simple pleasures, it enhances them. Even as his mind races far beyond the capabilities of those around him, he continues to find joy in fixing radios, in eating with friends, in falling in love. The film's approach to mortality is another layer that invites deep reflection. George's understanding of his own death isn't framed as a tragedy. It's presented as a part of life's natural rhythm. The film doesn't deny the sadness of his fate, but it also doesn't allow it to consume the story. Instead, it becomes a gentle meditation on what it means to live fully, to love fully, even when we know our time is limited. George doesn't waste his remaining days in fear or regret. He continues to ask questions, to build, to give, to connect. His life, though shortened, feels complete in its richness. The relationship between man and nature is also subtly present throughout the film. George's abilities are never about controlling nature. They're about understanding it, moving with it, learning from it. He doesn't conquer the world around him. He becomes more attuned to it. Whether it's through his experiments, his connection to the earth, or his quiet moments watching the sky, George's journey feels deeply tied to the rhythms of the natural world. It's as if his mind is not just expanding in knowledge, but also in harmony with life itself. There's a final, beautiful message that hovers just beneath the surface of the film. The idea that even when we are gone, the ripples we create remain. George's influence doesn't vanish with his death. He leaves behind seeds of knowledge, relationships that have been changed, hearts that have been opened. His life, though brief in its brilliance, continues to echo in the lives he touched. This idea is quietly, tenderly delivered, not through speeches or grand declarations, but through the lingering impact George has on those who loved him. Phenomenon invites us to sit with these questions and messages, not to rush past them or neatly resolve them. It leaves space for the audience to feel, to wonder, and to find their own answers. It's a story that respects the complexity of life and trusts its viewers to appreciate that some things are meant to be held gently, not explained fully. Let's dive even deeper into the beautiful, deliberate world-building of Phenomenon, 1996, because the film's set design and location choices are far more than just background. They are the heartbeat of the story. These carefully crafted spaces are not about cinematic spectacle. They are about atmosphere, mood, and building a tangible connection between the characters and the audience. What makes the set design of Phenomenon so impactful is that it creates a world where the extraordinary gently folds into the fabric of the ordinary, and this blending feels completely natural because of how deeply rooted the visuals are in authenticity. The town itself feels like a character in its own right. This isn't some generic movie town. It feels alive, specific, and rich with unseen stories. The streets are wide but never overly busy, and the sidewalks show the wear of daily life. There's a slowness here, a visual rhythm that speaks to a community where life moves at its own quiet pace. The shops, the post office, the local gas station, all of them are slightly weathered, imperfect in a way that feels honest. There's chipped paint on the storefronts, old hand-painted signs, and fences that have clearly been standing for decades. The choice to film in these kinds of spaces gives the story a sense of grounded permanence. This is a town where everyone knows each other, where nothing much ever changes, which is exactly why George's transformation feels so jarring within this environment. The hardware store where George works is a prime example of how the set design serves the story. It's not a flashy, overly neat place. It's cluttered, functional, and full of little details that tell you about George's life. There are old wooden counters, glass jars filled with nails and bolts, and shelves lined with dusty tools that probably haven't been touched in years. The cash register isn't digital. It's one of those old-school machines with satisfying clicks and clunks. This store isn't just where George works. It's where his curiosity begins to quietly flourish. His small experiments, his odd gadgets tucked in corners, his growing collection of books. All of these visual elements show the audience how George's mind is expanding, how he's beginning to see the world in a different way, even though his physical surroundings stay largely the same. The store becomes a subtle visual metaphor for George himself, unassuming on the outside, but filled with surprising depth. George's home is another layered, intimate space. It's not a picture-perfect movie house. It's modest, practical, and full of little imperfections. A squeaky screen door, mismatched furniture, and old wooden floors that creak when you walk across them. It's the kind of house where things aren't perfectly in place, but where everything feels personal. There are stacks of books on the kitchen table, papers scattered across the counters, and small tools lying around, suggesting that George is always building, always tinkering, always thinking. As his abilities grow, so does the quiet chaos inside his home. More books arrive, more papers fill the walls, more projects seem to be in progress. His home doesn't just reflect his life, it visually charts his transformation. The audience can almost see his expanding mind mirrored in the growing complexity of his surroundings. The outdoor spaces in the film are just as carefully chosen. The filmmakers use the vast, open landscapes of rural America to give the story breathing room. The wide fields, the empty roads, the long stretches of farmland, they all create a sense of openness and calm. These are places where the sky feels enormous and the horizon feels endless. When George rides his bicycle through these spaces, the cinematography captures the way he belongs to this environment. The natural world wraps around him, and as he begins to connect with the universe in a deeper way, the visual bond between George and these open, sunlit spaces becomes even more significant. The filmmakers didn't choose sterile, controlled backdrops. They wanted locations that felt alive, that had texture and memory, where the wind actually rustled the trees, where the dirt roads really kicked up dust. The diner, where much of the community's social life happens, is another gem of visual storytelling. It's a small, unpretentious place with a counter that's probably been wiped down thousands of times, red vinyl booths that have long since softened, and walls covered with old photographs and community notices. You can almost hear the echo of past conversations in this space. This diner is where people gather to share stories, where gossip spreads quickly, and where George's new abilities quickly become the center of attention. The set design of the diner isn't fancy, it's worn, familiar, and comfortable, which makes the subtle shifts in how people interact there even more meaningful. The same booth where George once sat unnoticed becomes the place where people start to watch him carefully, where curiosity turns into fear. The Town Festival is a perfect showcase of the film's commitment to authenticity. This isn't a slick, overproduced event. It's a community gathering with hand-painted signs, simple rides, and stalls that look like they've been assembled by local volunteers. The decorations aren't polished, the prizes aren't grand. It's all charmingly imperfect, which makes the festival feel completely real. The filmmakers understand that it's these small, imperfect details that build a believable world. You can feel the weight of tradition in this festival. The sense that this is something the town has done for generations, long before George's story began. Even the doctor's office is designed to reflect the town's modest, practical atmosphere. It's not a sterile, high-tech clinic. It's a small room with old furniture, shelves lined with medical books, and equipment that looks like it's been there for decades. This isn't just a visual choice. It subtly reinforces the idea that George's story isn't taking place in a world with immediate access to cutting-edge science. The town is almost isolated from the larger, faster world beyond it, which makes George's discovery and abilities feel even more unique and disruptive. The film's use of color and lighting also plays a crucial role in its visual storytelling. The warm tones of golden sunlight, the soft blues of twilight, the gentle greens of the surrounding countryside. All of these colors create a palette that feels natural, calm, and welcoming. There are no cold, clinical blues or harsh whites often found in typical sci-fi films. This color scheme keeps the story grounded, reminding the audience that, despite the extraordinary events unfolding, this is still a deeply human story about connection, community, and discovery. Props are another quiet but powerful part of the set design. George's truck, for example, is a simple, slightly battered vehicle that perfectly matches his character. It's reliable, it's not flashy, and it feels like it's been with him for years. The small items he carries, his books, his gardening tools, his sunglasses, all feel personally chosen and well-worn. Nothing in George's world feels new or decorative for its own sake. Every object carries weight. Every detail feels like it belongs to a life that was being lived long before the story began. As the story progresses, the physical spaces subtly shift to reflect the emotional journey. Let's go even deeper into the visual design and special effects of Phenomenon, 1996, because this film offers a quietly brilliant example of how less can truly be more when it comes to cinematic visuals. Unlike films that rely on layers of loud, digitally complex effects to dazzle the eye, Phenomenon takes a restrained, patient approach, where every visual detail is meant to serve the story, not overshadow it. The beauty of the film's visuals lies in their subtlety, their connection to real-world textures, and their ability to quietly immerse the audience in George's expanding reality without ever feeling artificial or excessive. The entire visual experience of the film is intentionally rooted in simplicity. It doesn't throw the viewer into futuristic laboratories or build vast sci-fi landscapes. Instead, it keeps us grounded in small-town America, a place that feels lived in, familiar, almost comfortingly ordinary. The streets, the shops, the dusty backroads, the local bars, they all feel authentic and unpolished, which makes George's growing powers feel all the more remarkable. The contrast between the extraordinary and the ordinary is essential here, and the film's visual team makes sure that George's abilities never overpower the world around him. The setting remains warm, intimate, and relatable, which creates a beautiful tension when small moments of visual magic quietly unfold. When George first sees the mysterious light in the sky, a moment that sparks his transformation. The visual effect is so simple and fleeting, but that's what makes it so effective. The light doesn't explode with special sound cues or drag the moment into heavy visual spectacle. It flickers briefly in the vastness of the night sky, feels just out of reach, and then it's gone. It leaves both George and the audience with the same feeling, a soft, unresolved curiosity. The CGI used here is subtle, never drawing attention to itself, which makes the event feel more real and more mysterious, as if it could actually happen in the quiet darkness of a summer night. As George's abilities grow, the visual effects continue to mirror the same gentle philosophy. Take, for example, the scenes where he moves objects with his mind. The filmmakers don't turn these moments into exaggerated set pieces where furniture flies across the room or buildings tremble. Instead, the movement is delicate, smooth, almost like the objects are responding to a faint breeze rather than brute telekinetic force. A pair of sunglasses slides across a table, a chair inches backward, a book rises into the air just enough to make you lean forward in your seat. These movements are supported by restrained CGI work that feels effortless, without digital fingerprints. The effects become almost invisible because they're so carefully matched to the film's natural lighting and physical textures. One of the most striking things about the visual effects is that they feel physically present. This is partly because the filmmakers cleverly use a mix of practical effects and CGI, ensuring that the objects George manipulates aren't just digital creations. They have real weight, real surfaces. When he moves something, the object responds naturally. It's not a glowing, pixelated shape that screams computer effect. It's something you can almost reach out and touch. This grounded approach keeps the magic believable. The filmmakers clearly wanted the audience to forget they were watching an effect at all, and instead simply experience the wonder of it as if it belonged in the world we know. The cinematography plays a critical role in supporting these effects. The film often frames George in wide shots that include natural backdrops, fields, streets, trees, open skies. By doing this, the story constantly reinforces the idea that his powers exist within the normal world, not in some separate cinematic realm. The lighting is always soft, realistic, and often sun-soaked, creating a visual warmth that matches the film's emotional tone. Even when extraordinary things happen, the color palette stays familiar. Gentle browns, greens, and blues that reflect George's connection to nature and to his community. Sound design is also a silent partner to the visual effects. There's a purposeful quietness in many of George's telekinetic moments. The filmmakers resist the temptation to pair every movement with booming sound effects or exaggerated audio cues. Instead, they let the soundscape remain natural, using subtle audio touches, a soft whoosh, a faint hum, that make the object's movement feel like a natural extension of George's presence, not a spectacle designed to impress the audience. This careful restraint in both sound and visuals allows the emotional weight of the moment to land without distraction. Even the more visually impossible moments, like when George absorbs information rapidly or visualizes complex patterns, are not turned into computer-generated fireworks. The film doesn't flood the screen with high-speed data streams or flashing graphics. Instead, it uses clever editing, quick cuts, dissolves, and layered images that suggest George's mental speed without spelling it out in digital shorthand. This artistic decision not only keeps the film visually consistent, but also makes the audience feel like they're inside George's head, seeing the world as he experiences it. Another layer of visual storytelling comes from the way the film uses natural elements to hint at George's connection to the world around him. Scenes where George stares at the sky, gently works in his garden, or simply walks through sunlit fields create a visual rhythm that ties his extraordinary mind to the simplicity of the earth. The cinematography captures long stretches of open sky, the slow rustling of trees, the soft light filtering through leaves. These moments feel almost meditative and serve as a visual anchor that balances the subtle special effects with nature's quiet grandeur. The visual team also makes powerful use of restraint during the film's emotional climaxes. When George's condition is revealed and his abilities begin to fade, the film doesn't reach for grand visual gestures. There's no dramatic collapse of power, no visual explosion of energy. Instead, the loss is shown in small, intimate ways. His telekinetic control falters, his once quick hands become slow, his gaze becomes distant. The special effects gently retreat, mirroring his diminishing abilities, until all that's left is the raw human emotion of a man facing his own mortality. The visual scale shrinks, the frame tightens, and the audience is invited to focus not on what George can do, but on who he is. The film's overall visual philosophy is one of harmony. The effects, the practical setups, the cinematography, the lighting, and the sound all work together to create a unified world where extraordinary things can happen in ordinary places, and it all feels possible. The special effects are never the main attraction. They are carefully placed tools that elevate the story without overwhelming it. What Phenomenon ultimately proves through its visual design is that subtlety can be far more powerful than spectacle. The film doesn't try to shout its magic at you. It quietly offers it, like a whispered invitation to believe. The visual effects don't need to dominate the screen because the story is already strong enough to hold your attention. The visuals simply glide alongside the narrative, lifting it, enhancing it, and helping it resonate on a deeply human level. Let's take an even deeper dive into the script and dialogue of Phenomenon, 1996, because the film's writing is one of its most quietly powerful achievements. The beauty of the script lies in how it builds emotional intimacy without ever relying on big, theatrical moments. It works in layers, sometimes in what is spoken, sometimes in what's held back, sometimes in what's completely left unsaid. This is a film that fully understands how people really talk to each other when they're vulnerable, when they're in awe, when they're afraid, and when they're trying to hold on to something that's slipping away. One of the most impressive things about the dialogue is that it never feels like it's trying to perform for the audience. These are not polished, writerly lines designed to become instant movie quotes. They are organic. They feel like natural extensions of the characters who speak them. And because of that, when George Malley speaks, we're not hearing a man delivering lines. We're hearing a man trying to make sense of what's happening to him. His words often arrive with a kind of quiet hesitation, like he's carefully working through each thought as he says it, which makes his emotional journey so believable. Even when his intellect grows beyond everyone around him, his way of speaking remains grounded, approachable, and warm. The pacing of the dialogue is also meticulously handled. It never rushes. There's breathing room in every conversation. George's exchanges with Lace, Nate, the doctor, and the townspeople unfold in rhythms that feel true to life. People interrupt each other. They trail off mid-thought. They use small, familiar phrases instead of grand statements. This is not accidental. It's a deliberate choice that makes the world feel lived in. It allows emotions to bubble to the surface in a way that feels earned, not forced. One of the most quietly heartbreaking aspects of the dialogue is the way George's growing abilities start to isolate him. Not just physically, but linguistically. As he becomes more intelligent, he begins to understand things that no one else can. And the distance that creates is subtly reflected in how his conversations begin to shift. Early in the film, George is fully part of the town's social rhythm. His banter, his jokes, his storytelling all align perfectly with the world around him. But as he changes, there's a growing sense of disconnect. The people who once joked with him now struggle to relate. His words become slightly out of sync with the community's simple language. The script never makes this feel abrupt. It's a slow, natural drift that builds throughout the film, and it's one of the most emotionally resonant threads in the story. Take the conversations between George and Lace. Their relationship is shaped by what they both do and don't say to each other. Lace isn't a woman who easily trusts people. Her words, especially in the beginning, are guarded, careful. She often answers questions indirectly, or she changes the subject to avoid revealing too much of herself. And George, who is endlessly patient with her, never pushes her to open up too quickly. Their early dialogue is filled with unspoken tension, playful on the surface, but with deeper emotions simmering underneath. When she finally starts to let her guard down, her words become more open, more vulnerable, but the script never turns this into a melodramatic reveal. Instead, her honesty arrives in small, meaningful pieces. It feels authentic because that's how trust really builds between people. It's rarely in one big moment. It's in dozens of quiet ones. George's friendship with Nate is another perfect example of how the script uses dialogue to create real emotional texture. Nate's way of speaking is loose, comfortable, filled with humor, but underneath the teasing there's a deep well of care. When Nate talks to George, especially after George's transformation, there's no pretension, no scientific curiosity. There's just the pure instinct of a friend who loves his buddy and doesn't need complicated explanations to stand by him. Their conversations are filled with these little moments where Nate pretends to be dismissive or unimpressed, but the tone always betrays how deeply he's invested in George's well-being. This is a friendship built on shared history, and the way they speak to each other reflects that bond. They can have entire conversations with half-sentences, inside jokes, and unspoken understanding. The film captures that perfectly. The town's shifting attitude toward George is another place where the dialogue quietly carries enormous weight. In the beginning, people talk to George with familiarity and affection. They joke with him, they trust him, they invite him into their lives. But as his abilities become more apparent, their words begin to change. Not in sudden accusations or angry speeches, but in subtle, cautious phrasing, in questions that carry an edge of suspicion, in sentences that trail off because they don't know how to ask what they're really thinking. It's in the hesitations, the nervous glances, the growing formality in the way they address him. The dialogue allows us to feel how quickly admiration can sour into fear when something, or someone, no longer fits comfortably within the known world. Even the scenes where George is explaining what he's learning are written with remarkable care. The film could have easily slipped into scientific jargon or overwritten explanations to show off his intelligence, but the script resists that. Instead, George's excitement about learning feels accessible and human. When he describes how he's reading faster, how he's seeing patterns, how he's understanding energy in ways he never did before, it's always about wonder, not about showing off. His words convey curiosity, not superiority. That's a crucial choice because it keeps George relatable, even as his mind races ahead of those around him. One of the most emotionally loaded moments comes when George, faced with his inevitable fate, speaks with a kind of peaceful resignation. His words are calm, simple, but they carry the weight of someone who has made peace with his extraordinary and fleeting gift. The power in these lines doesn't come from dramatic delivery. It comes from the way the script trusts the audience to feel the gravity of what George is saying without embellishment. He talks about letting go, about appreciating the beauty he's seen, and about the brief window he was given to touch something bigger than himself. The quietness of these moments is what makes them so profoundly moving. Throughout the film, the script also uses moments of humor to cut through the tension and to ground the story in the rhythms of real life. George's occasional deadpan jokes, Nate's sarcastic one-liners, and the playful teasing among the townspeople keep the story from ever becoming too heavy. The humor isn't there to distract. It's there because that's how real communities work. People laugh together even when things are hard. The film's dialogue understands that perfectly. The way the children in the film speak to George is another lovely detail. Their words aren't weighed down by fear or suspicion. They're curious, direct, and often refreshingly honest. In their conversations with George, the script shows us a pure kind of acceptance that stands in contrast to the guarded, sometimes fearful language of the adults. The children don't need complicated explanations. They just like George for who he is. This simple, childlike language adds another layer to the story's emotional landscape. Let's push even further into the genre and style choices of Phenomenon, 1996. Because what this film does is genuinely fascinating when you sit with it long enough. It is a film that constantly plays with the edges of multiple genres without fully stepping inside the boundaries of any one of them. It teases science fiction, it flirts with romance, it dips into small-town drama, and it touches on philosophical reflection. But at every turn, it seems more interested in stepping back, slowing down, and doing the opposite of what convention would expect. This is where its quiet genius sits. The film opens like a typical science fiction story might begin. A flash of mysterious light in the sky on George Malley's birthday, a sudden physical reaction, and then a rapid onset of extraordinary intellectual growth. Now, in almost every sci-fi story that starts this way, this moment would become the launching pad for a grand narrative filled with questions about aliens, cosmic forces, or hidden conspiracies. But Phenomenon doesn't follow that thread. It sets it on the table, and then walks right past it. The light in the sky is never the point. It's a doorway, not a destination. This film intentionally resists becoming a plot-driven science fiction film. The story doesn't hinge on discovering where the light came from, whether George has been chosen, or if the event is part of some larger plan. Instead, the event is used as a device to explore character, community, fear, love, and the deeply human question. How do we handle the things we can't explain? How do we love someone when they are no longer who we thought they were? And how do we accept what we don't understand? This is why Phenomenon works so well. It invites us to lean in expecting science fiction, but then holds us with something far more intimate. The pacing is another deliberate stylistic choice that pushes against the genre's usual rhythm. Science fiction films with extraordinary events typically race from one discovery to the next. There's usually a countdown, an urgent race to solve the mystery, or a growing threat that pushes the narrative forward with intensity. But in Phenomenon, the pacing is almost meditative. The story unfolds with the quiet pulse of a small-town life where people still have time to gather at the local bar, chat under the stars, and walk slowly through their daily routines. Even as George's intelligence accelerates, the film refuses to speed up. It's as if the story is reminding us that even extraordinary things still happen inside the same ordinary clock. This approach affects the film's tone in a significant way. The story never feels like it's in a rush to impress you. It's not trying to dazzle with complex sci-fi set pieces or technological wonders. Instead, it finds magic in the simplest places. In the way George learns languages overnight, in how he gently bends keys with his mind, in his quiet experiments with plant growth. There are no flashing laboratories or sleek gadgets here. The film chooses to keep the phenomena grounded in backyard gardens, dusty bookshelves, and quiet moments in the garage. This stylistic restraint makes the extraordinary feel accessible, even believable, which keeps the emotional stakes front and center. The film also quietly deconstructs the outsider genius trope that so many stories fall into. In those stories, when someone suddenly gains superhuman intelligence, they usually become isolated, frustrated by the stupidity of others, often developing a kind of arrogance that eventually leads to their downfall. But George never crosses into that territory. His character isn't driven by a need to prove his superiority. He isn't angry at the people who can't keep up with him. His greatest desire, even as his mind evolves, is to remain connected, to his friends, to Lace, to his community. He wants to belong, not to rise above. That choice is where Phenomenon does something beautifully unexpected. In most genre films, belonging is usually tied to some dramatic redemption arc where the hero must save the town, or the world to earn acceptance. But George doesn't need to save anyone in a grand, cinematic way. His quiet acts of kindness, his attempts to repair relationships, his small scientific discoveries, these are the things that define his journey. His heroism is domestic, everyday, and profoundly human. The romance between George and Lace is another area where the film's style breaks from expectation. In many films with a romantic subplot, especially those touching on science fiction, the love story is either a convenient device or an emotional shortcut to make the hero more relatable. But here, their relationship is the emotional spine of the story. It is layered, hesitant, and beautifully messy. Lace is not written as the typical love interest who is swept off her feet by George's abilities. She's cautious, even distant at times, because she's been hurt before. Her reluctance is given space to breathe, and the film allows their relationship to unfold at a natural, almost stubbornly patient pace. There's no grand gesture that suddenly flips a switch. Their connection grows in small, tender moments. In the way George repairs her chairs, in the way he respects her need for distance, in the way they both slowly let their walls down. This patient storytelling is where the film finds its emotional depth. The humor in the film, especially through George's friendship with Nate, gives Phenomenon a lightness that beautifully offsets its more serious themes. But even here, the humor isn't used in a genre-typical way. It's not inserted for comic relief between action beats, because there are no action beats. The humor is part of the texture of the world. It's in the way friends tease each other, the way small towns buzz with gossip, and the way ordinary life stubbornly continues even when something extraordinary is happening. The humor is grounded, familiar, and often quietly poignant because it reminds us that life's oddities don't stop us from finding joy in the day-to-day. The film's treatment of fear and suspicion is another place where it plays with genre expectations. In a traditional sci-fi drama, the community would likely become an active threat to George, and the story would escalate toward confrontation or persecution. Phenomenon avoids that sensationalism. The fear the townspeople feel isn't overblown or villainized. It's subtle. It's in the way people start to pull back, in how their language shifts from affection to curiosity to caution. The film captures how people slowly distance themselves from what they don't understand, but it doesn't push them into the role of cartoonish antagonists. Even those who are wary of George still carry traces of their former affection for him. This subtle handling of the community's fear keeps the story anchored in emotional realism. The medical explanation for George's abilities, which arrives late in the film, is a brilliant genre twist because it strips away the potential for a larger-than-life science fiction ending. Instead of discovering he's been touched by an alien force or gifted with supernatural power, the explanation is entirely human, entirely tragic. His brain is changing because of a rare tumor, and his extraordinary abilities come at the cost of his life. It's a twist that grounds the film completely in the human experience. It pulls the story back from cosmic wonder into something deeply personal. How do we face our mortality when life gives us a brief, unexpected spark of greatness? Let's dive even deeper into the social and cultural layers of Phenomenon, 1996, because the more you examine this film, the more you realize it's not just a simple story about a man with sudden extraordinary abilities. It's a thoughtful commentary on how we, as people, as communities, as societies, respond to things we don't understand. The film is like a quiet social experiment that plays out in real time, testing the limits of human acceptance, compassion, and curiosity in the face of the unknown. When George Malley's abilities begin to emerge, the initial reaction of those around him is fascination, even admiration. But very quickly, that curiosity turns into discomfort, and that discomfort soon hardens into fear and distance. What the film captures beautifully is this gradual social shift. This is not an overnight rejection. It's subtle, it creeps in. At first, people laugh with him, marvel at his skills, and crowd around to watch him solve puzzles and perform mental feats. But as his abilities continue to grow beyond what's considered safe or explainable, the warmth he once enjoyed begins to cool. People stop showing up to his garage. Old friends hesitate before greeting him. Whispers replace handshakes. The film paints this slow but steady alienation as a deeply human instinct. It's not that people suddenly decide to turn against George. It's that they don't know what to do with him anymore. There's a sharp social commentary here about how communities often draw invisible boundaries around what they can accept. It's easy to love people when they fit comfortably within those boundaries, when their talents, ideas, and behaviors feel familiar, manageable, and non-threatening. But when someone steps beyond those lines, even with no ill intent, the community's instinct is to push them back or push them out. Phenomenon quietly shows that social acceptance is fragile, and that people who become too different risk losing their place in the community, even if their differences are beautiful, even if they offer something valuable. This dynamic plays into a larger cultural theme about the fear of change. George doesn't just change as a person. He represents change itself. His abilities challenge the town's assumptions about what is possible. He forces them to confront the fact that the world might not be as simple or as explainable as they'd like to believe. And this scares them. The film captures this perfectly in the way the townspeople begin to talk about George. They don't accuse him of anything directly. Instead, they start to question him quietly, to eye him with suspicion, to avoid him just enough to make him feel alone. It's a kind of soft rejection. A passive form of exclusion that often happens in real-life communities when people are faced with things they don't understand. It's not outright hostility. It's the slow, cold drifting away. The way Phenomenon handles the institutional response to George's abilities is another layer of its social critique. When the military and medical experts get involved, their approach is clinical, detached, and focused on control. They don't see George as a person. They see him as a phenomenon, a subject, a potential weapon or scientific puzzle. This echoes real-world patterns where institutions, especially those connected to power structures, often prioritize analysis, containment, and exploitation over understanding and empathy. When someone like George falls outside the normal spectrum, the system's first instinct isn't to support him, it's to dissect him, to figure out how to harness or neutralize his difference. The film uses this to highlight a quiet but significant truth. Our systems are often not built to nurture outliers. They're built to manage them. But Phenomenon doesn't just examine how society handles George. It also shows how George handles society. His response to rejection isn't bitterness or arrogance. He doesn't retreat into intellectual superiority or lash out at those who misunderstand him. Instead, he continues to reach out, to try to stay connected, to use his abilities to help those around him. There's a powerful social message here about resilience and the choice to remain compassionate in the face of exclusion. George never becomes the misunderstood genius who looks down on everyone else. He's deeply human, still craving connection, still valuing the people who have stepped away from him. This speaks to the quiet dignity of remaining kind even when the world pulls away from you. The film's treatment of masculinity is also worth lingering on. George represents a kind of masculinity that is rare in many stories of extraordinary power. He is strong, but not in the traditional sense of dominance or control. His strength comes from his patience, his empathy, his openness. He's not afraid to show excitement when he learns something new. He's not afraid to grieve openly when faced with his fate. He's not afraid to pursue love with sincerity and tenderness. In a cultural landscape where men are often expected to be stoic, distant, or tough, George stands in quiet opposition. He models a masculinity that embraces vulnerability as a form of courage. And in doing so, the film gently pushes back against cultural expectations that often limit emotional expression in men. Lace's character also offers subtle social commentary, especially when viewed through the lens of her cautious romance with George. She is a single mother in a small town, which is a role that often comes with its own set of social pressures and assumptions. The film respects her space and her hesitations. Lace isn't drawn to George because of his intelligence or his powers. She is drawn to his consistency, his patience, and his genuine respect for her boundaries. The film avoids the trope of the woman who is quickly swept off her feet by the extraordinary man. Instead, it gives Lace the room to slowly decide for herself whether she can trust George, whether she can risk letting someone in. This reflects a quiet cultural message about the importance of autonomy, of moving at your own pace, especially in relationships that develop under the watchful eyes of a tightly knit community. On a broader level, the film also comments on how communities process grief, especially when that grief is complicated by uncertainty and unanswered questions. George's illness and his impending death force those around him to confront their own limitations. Not just intellectual limitations, but emotional ones. The people who initially withdrew from him eventually return, not because they fully understand him, but because they realize that their fear cost them precious time. This is a powerful statement on how we often let our confusion and discomfort get in the way of love and connection, only to regret it when it's too late. Phenomenon also gently critiques the idea that scientific discovery must always be tied to personal gain or external validation. George's rapid intellectual growth isn't used to accumulate wealth, fame, or influence. He uses it to help his community in small ways, to grow better crops, to understand natural patterns, to fix things that others might have given up on. His knowledge is used to uplift, not to dominate. This is a subtle rebuke to a cultural model that often measures success in terms of how much power or status one can achieve. George's version of success is measured by how much good he can do for the people around him, even when they no longer know how to love him properly. Let's take this emotional engagement even further because Phenomenon is not just a film that moves you during its runtime. It's a story that invites you to think, to feel, and to quietly question your own life in the hours, days, and sometimes even years after you've seen it. It's a film that works like an emotional ripple, gently but persistently widening its reach long after the screen fades to black. One of the film's most emotionally powerful aspects is how it blurs the line between the extraordinary and the ordinary. George's abilities are undeniably remarkable, moving objects, absorbing information at superhuman speed, unlocking secrets of nature. But the emotional core of the story isn't driven by the spectacle of these powers. The heart of the film is rooted in George's unwavering desire for connection. The audience is not left marveling at his telekinesis. We're left wondering about his loneliness, about his need to be understood, about his heartbreak as the people around him slowly back away. This is where the film does something rare. It takes something potentially grand and makes it intimate. The powers are just the surface. The real story is about belonging. There's a unique kind of sadness that Phenomenon taps into, the sadness of being loved conditionally. George begins as everyone's favorite mechanic, the helpful neighbor, the familiar face in the small town. People like him because they understand him. But as he changes, that love begins to fracture. It's a very real and very painful human fear. The idea that we are only loved as long as we stay inside the box that people have built for us. The film pushes the audience to confront this uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, people don't leave you because you've done something wrong. They leave you because you've become something they don't know how to handle. That emotional complexity lingers throughout the film, making every moment where George still chooses kindness, still chooses to help, feel incredibly moving. He could have easily withdrawn, but he doesn't. He keeps reaching out. He keeps showing up. That quiet resilience is deeply affecting. The film also taps into another powerful emotional theme: the burden of knowledge. When George's mind accelerates beyond normal human limits, he isn't drunk with power, he's overwhelmed by it. His hunger to learn is not about ego, it's a desperate search for answers. Why is this happening to him? What does it mean? Can he control it? Can he use it to do good? The more he learns, the more isolated he becomes. Knowledge in this story is both a gift and a curse. It distances him from his community. It makes him a subject of fear. It accelerates his journey toward an inevitable ending. The audience feels this weight along with George. The realization that sometimes knowing more doesn't bring peace, it brings sorrow. Sometimes understanding the truth doesn't set you free. It forces you to say goodbye. This is beautifully reinforced by the way the film builds its emotional pacing. The moments when George quietly realizes what his abilities are doing to his relationships are some of the most emotionally resonant in the film. There's no big confrontation, no shouting match, no melodrama. It's in the silences. It's in the way people avoid his gaze. It's in the subtle shifts in how people speak to him. These moments hit harder than loud arguments because they mirror the real-life experience of emotional distance. It usually doesn't arrive as a thunderclap. It's the slow erosion of closeness. It's the space that builds between people, one awkward pause at a time. And then there's the profound emotional impact of George's relationship with Lace and her children. This subplot is handled with such restraint and authenticity that it quietly becomes one of the most beautiful parts of the film. George's affection for Lace's children is not performative. It's patient, it's steady, and it's deeply respectful. He isn't trying to dazzle them with his abilities or win them over with grand gestures. Instead, he shows up for them in small, meaningful ways. He repairs things. He listens. He gives them space to trust him in their own time. The emotional weight of this relationship is amplified by the knowledge that George won't be there forever. The love he builds with Lace and her family is not about permanence. It's about presence. It's about choosing to give love even when you know you may not have the time to see it fully returned. That is heartbreakingly beautiful and profoundly human. The emotional stakes are also tied to the way George faces his mortality. When he learns that his extraordinary abilities are the result of a terminal brain tumor, the film doesn't shift into panic or desperation. Instead, George's acceptance is remarkably calm, almost peaceful. He chooses to spend his remaining time in the company of those he loves, doing what he can to leave something good behind. This choice is incredibly moving because it speaks to the quiet courage of facing death without rage, without bargaining, but with a sense of gratitude for the time he had. There is an emotional softness to his journey that makes the story linger in the heart. The audience is not crushed by his fate. They are humbled by his grace. Even the smaller emotional beats carry surprising weight. The way George's best friend Nate stands by him, refusing to pull away even as others do, becomes a subtle but powerful commentary on loyalty. Nate's unwavering support reminds the audience that true friendship isn't about always understanding, it's about choosing to stay. These kinds of relationships, where people stand with you in confusion, in fear and uncertainty, are the ones that leave a lasting emotional imprint. The scenes between George and Nate are often understated, but they pulse with quiet emotion. What makes the emotional engagement of Phenomenon so unique is that it refuses to take the easy path. The film could have leaned into spectacle. It could have made George a superhero or a savior. But instead, it anchors itself in small moments. A hand held, a glance exchanged, a tear that's quickly brushed away. It's in these tiny, honest fragments that the film builds its emotional world. The audience feels invited, not forced, to step inside that world. There's no manipulation here, just an open door to walk through if you're willing to feel something real. By the end, the emotional resonance doesn't come from the fact that George had powers. It comes from the fact that he lived with intention, that he loved openly, that he remained kind in the face of fear and rejection. The audience is left not with the memory of his telekinesis, but with the memory of his humanity. The emotional journey is one of connection, loss, and the choice to embrace wonder, even when life is fleeting. Phenomenon isn't just about what happens to George. It's about what happens to the people around him and what happens to us as viewers. It leaves us quietly asking ourselves, how would we react if we were in that town? Would we choose to understand? Or would we choose to step back? Would we offer compassion? Or would we retreat into fear? It's a film that leaves you not with a heavy heart, but with a reflective one. A rare kind of emotional afterglow that invites you to return to it. Not because you miss something in the plot, but because you want to feel its quiet magic again. Let's dive even deeper because Phenomenon isn't just a film that sits quietly in its genre. It actually challenges the way we usually think about these kinds of stories. When most people hear about a movie where an ordinary man suddenly gains extraordinary mental abilities, they probably expect a fast-paced thriller, a secret society plotline, or a journey into superhuman status. But Phenomenon completely sidesteps that formula. It doesn't even try to fit into the traditional boxes. In fact, it deliberately takes you in the opposite direction. It's a film that gently pushes back against the typical expectations and instead says, what if these powers don't lead to a bigger world but to a smaller, more personal one? If you compare it to Limitless, for example, you see how other films often link extraordinary intelligence to ambition, danger, and social climbing. In Limitless, the main character becomes obsessed with using his abilities to get rich, get powerful, and outrun his enemies. The story spins around greed, manipulation, and high-speed success. Phenomenon flips that completely. George doesn't chase money or fame. He's not looking to control people or expand his territory. He's trying to understand tomatoes. He's trying to fix radios. He's trying to be a better friend. His powers don't pull him into a world of high-stakes finance or political intrigue. They pull him deeper into his own backyard. Where Limitless is about what you can conquer when you become more, Phenomenon is about who you might lose when you change in ways people can't understand. Think about Lucy, where Scarlett Johansson's character becomes almost godlike by the end. Her journey takes her from a regular person to a being who can manipulate time and space. It's all about power reaching its ultimate peak. But George's story is more humble, more restrained, and far more grounded. His powers don't lift him above humanity. They isolate him from it. Phenomenon isn't interested in the edge of the universe. It's interested in the edges of human connection. In what happens when people start to treat you like you're something other than yourself. That's where the real tension lives. Not in what George can do, but in whether the people he loves will still see him as George. When compared to Powder, there are some obvious similarities. Both films deal with gifted men who are outcasts in small communities. Both explore how fear and ignorance can push people away from someone they don't understand. But Powder leans more heavily into its fantasy elements. It feels more like a fable, with lightning strikes and high drama. Phenomenon is much quieter in its storytelling. It doesn't want to feel magical. It wants to feel real. Powder's character is distant, almost mythic. George is someone you might know. Someone you might have grown up with. The story stays rooted in his local diner, his garage, his small circle of friends. The everyday setting is never abandoned in favor of spectacle. That's what makes it unique. It chooses simplicity over grandeur every time. And when you start to think about other stories that involve a sudden change in a person's life, like The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, Phenomenon still manages to carve out its own lane. In Benjamin Button, the character is physically aging backward, and the story spends a lot of time exploring that as a fantastical, almost tragic condition. But Phenomenon is less about the physical and more about the mind. George's condition isn't immediately visible. It doesn't shock people on sight. It's the slow discovery, the moment when people begin to realize he's no longer normal, that makes the story quietly powerful. And instead of focusing on the tragedy of his condition, the film zeroes in on the choice to love, to persist, to connect, even when the clock is running out. When we think about movies where ordinary people have to confront something extraordinary, we often land in the world of Field of Dreams. A man hears a voice, builds something impossible, and changes the lives around him. But even Field of Dreams leans heavily into magical realism. Phenomenon dances just at the edge of that genre, but always keeps one foot firmly planted in reality. There are no glowing portals or celestial moments here. Just a man sitting on his porch, puzzling over what's happening to him, while the rest of the town starts to back away. And if you really explore Jon Turteltaub's broader filmography, you realize how rare it is for him to make something this emotionally delicate. Turteltaub is more famously tied to big, energetic films like National Treasure, where the pacing is quick, the stakes are high, and the audience is always looking for the next clue. But Phenomenon feels like the work of someone who wanted to slow things down. It doesn't rely on plot twists or adrenaline to keep you watching. It counts on your investment in George as a person. It trusts that you'll care enough to stay with him even when the biggest moment in the story isn't a car chase or a grand revelation. It's a simple, heart-wrenching conversation under a tree. Even when compared to other stories about men facing terminal illness, like My Life with Michael Keaton, Phenomenon holds its own quiet uniqueness. In My Life, the character is desperately preparing for his death, racing to leave something behind for his unborn child. The urgency drives the story. But George's journey feels less frantic, less about racing the clock and more about savoring what time he has left. He's still learning, still helping, still loving. His condition doesn't lead him to a bucket list. It leads him to be present, to be open, to be soft even when people start to pull away. Where other films in this loose genre sometimes lean into melodrama, Phenomenon stays honest. It's never trying to wrench tears from the audience through manipulation. It's not setting you up for grand emotional breakdowns. It's interested in the quiet moments, the hand that lingers a second too long, the way someone's voice catches mid-sentence, the silent realization that things will never go back to the way they were. That's where it finds its power. And when you compare it to similar romance-driven sci-fi dramas like The Time Traveler's Wife, Phenomenon offers something that feels even more grounded, because it doesn't get caught in the complexities of time loops or impossible logic. It focuses purely on emotional logic. The way people react to change. The way they pull back from what they fear. The way they sometimes come back around when they realize what they've lost. The movie stands out because it refuses to be flashy. It stands out because it trades in spectacle for subtlety. It stands out because it believes that the most extraordinary thing in the world isn't telekinesis. It's the ability to love, to stay kind, to keep offering yourself to others even when you know you're running out of time. In a genre full of races against the clock, high-tech laboratories, world-shaking conspiracies, and memory-warping twists, Phenomenon sits quietly at the edge, reminding us that sometimes the biggest story is the one playing out in a tiny town, inside one person's heart. And that makes it unforgettable in its own, quietly brilliant way. Let's go even further into the deep layers of symbolism and metaphors in Phenomenon, because the film is rich with details that quietly but powerfully shape the way the story resonates. At its core, Phenomenon isn't just telling a story about a man who changes. It's telling a story about how we all confront change, mortality, isolation, and the boundaries of human connection. And it uses carefully chosen symbols to explore those ideas, without ever drawing loud attention to them. The light that begins George's transformation is not just a literal flash. It represents the moment of awakening, the crossing into unknown territory. Light has always symbolized knowledge, revelation, and a higher awareness in literature and film. When George is struck by the mysterious light, it's as if the universe is handing him a key to a deeper understanding of life, but that gift is bittersweet. The light awakens his mind, but it also begins the countdown to his isolation. Throughout the film, the presence of light often accompanies moments where George is discovering something new, making a breakthrough, or stepping closer to his fate. His association with light makes him stand apart from others. He becomes illuminated in a world that prefers to stay in the comfortable shadows of familiarity. There's also the garden, one of the most quietly powerful metaphors running through the film. George's garden is not just a plot of land where he grows food. It's a symbol of his deep connection to life, growth, and the natural world. His obsession with making his tomatoes grow better, stronger, and faster mirrors his own accelerated intellectual growth. But the garden also serves as a reminder that no matter how much we learn, some things remain outside our control. Plants have their own pace. Nature has its own timetable. George's fascination with improving the garden is his subconscious attempt to master time and mortality. But even in this, there's a gentle sadness because we know, and maybe he knows too, that life's most important cycles can't be rushed or cheated. His relationship with the townspeople is itself a living, breathing metaphor. Their growing fear and suspicion represent society's often instinctive rejection of what is different, what it doesn't understand, what challenges the status quo. George becomes a mirror for their insecurities. His abilities force them to confront the limits of their own understanding, and rather than being curious, they retreat. The townspeople's withdrawal and suspicion symbolize the fragile boundaries of acceptance in tight-knit communities. It speaks to how quickly people can go from admiration to fear when faced with the unfamiliar. George's increasing alienation becomes a metaphor for how those who change, who grow beyond what's expected, often find themselves walking alone. The earthquake moment isn't just a display of power. It's a direct physical manifestation of George's emotional turmoil and the shattering of social stability around him. The ground shaking beneath their feet reflects the emotional and psychological shaking happening inside George and the people who witness his transformation. It's a symbol that something unshakable has shifted, that their world will never be quite the same. The earth, usually steady and reliable, momentarily betrays them, just as their belief systems are betraying them. The earthquake's timing, tied to George's demonstration, suggests that when the truth is forced into the open, the very foundation of what people believe begins to crumble. There's also a beautiful, subtle use of books and writing throughout the story. George's compulsive need to read and document his learning serves as a symbol for his desperate attempt to hold on to what's slipping away. As his mind accelerates, he's driven to capture and preserve knowledge, to leave something behind. His notebooks become more than just records. They are his legacy, his way of proving that he existed, that his journey mattered. In a way, the act of writing becomes George's rebellion against time. It's his attempt to create permanence in a life that's suddenly become fleeting. The way he immerses himself in books also serves as a quiet metaphor for self-discovery. He's not just reading to know more. He's reading to understand who he is becoming. The apple George levitates is another carefully placed symbol. The apple has long been tied to knowledge, especially in religious and mythological stories like the tale of Adam and Eve. In Phenomenon, George's levitating apple is a gentle but profound visual. He's literally holding knowledge in his hands, suspended, controlled, but also separated from him. It's a perfect symbol for George's journey. He can reach out and touch incredible knowledge, but he cannot fully possess it, nor can he escape the consequences that come with it. The apple moment isn't flashy. It's quietly beautiful, a demonstration of his abilities that still feels personal, almost like a private conversation with the universe. Lace's chairs also carry layered meaning. She builds chairs throughout the film, and while that seems like a background detail, it's actually a tender metaphor for her emotional journey. Chairs are places of rest, comfort, and welcome, and Lace is someone who has closed herself off emotionally due to past pain. Her careful crafting of chairs is like her cautious crafting of trust. She's building the capacity to offer someone else a place in her life again. When she eventually shares her chair with George, figuratively and literally, it signals her decision to let him into her guarded heart. The chairs, these simple wooden objects, become quiet symbols of love, patience, and emotional safety. Even the mirror moments in the film are loaded with meaning. George's solitary glances into mirrors reflect his internal struggle to reconcile who he is with who he is becoming. He's changing so rapidly that even his own reflection seems foreign to him. The mirror becomes a silent companion to his transformation. A place where George has to confront himself without pretense, without the judgments of others. It's in these moments that we, as viewers, are reminded that the greatest battle isn't between George and society. It's between George and his own fleeting sense of self. The radio waves George manipulates serve as another layered symbol. Radios are about communication, about bridging distances and reaching across invisible barriers. George's ability to control frequencies mirrors his desire to connect, to lace to his friends, to the townspeople who are pulling away. It's as if, through his powers, he's trying to extend an invisible hand, to remain part of a community that's slowly isolating him. The radio, a simple tool in a quiet town, becomes a metaphor for connection, for tuning into one another's frequency, for overcoming the static of fear and misunderstanding. Even George's motorcycle has subtle symbolic weight. It's not just his vehicle. It represents freedom, the ability to move, to escape, to choose his path. But as his illness progresses, his freedom becomes more limited, and the motorcycle starts to feel like a symbol of what he's losing. His physical independence is slipping away, even as his mind expands. The contrast between the speed of the motorcycle and the inevitable slowing of his body is quietly heartbreaking. The film's use of silence is also deeply metaphorical. There are moments when George simply sits, thinking, listening, or sharing a quiet space with someone else. Let's take this even further and really dig into how Phenomenon compares to similar films across genres, directors' work, and Hollywood storytelling traditions, because the more you peel back the layers, the more you realize that Phenomenon stands in a very specific, almost rare cinematic space. It borrows familiar emotional beats from other films, but presents them in a way that feels unusually restrained and quietly powerful. When you line it up against other films that deal with extraordinary abilities or sudden intellectual awakenings, you might immediately think of Powder, 1995, which came out around the same time. Both films feature small-town settings, central characters with unexplainable powers, and a deeply emotional core that focuses on isolation and acceptance. But Phenomenon distinguishes itself because it doesn't lean as heavily into the tragic outsider narrative that Powder does. Instead, it grounds its story in something more familiar and less stylized. George Malley isn't visually marked as different, nor does he carry an aura of mystery in the way the character of Powder does. George is just a regular man who changes from the inside, making the story feel less like a fable and more like a quiet, plausible miracle happening in an everyday life. If you step into the broader genre of films about sudden genius or unlocked human potential, you can compare Phenomenon to Limitless, 2011. Both films follow a protagonist who suddenly becomes exponentially more intelligent, but their tones are miles apart. Limitless takes the fast-paced thriller route. It's all about ambition, power, greed, and danger. Phenomenon, on the other hand, is deliberately slow, gentle, and reflective. It doesn't care about how much power George can accumulate. It cares about how much he can understand about himself, his relationships, and his place in the world. Where Limitless focuses on the seductive side of enhanced intelligence, Phenomenon focuses on the bittersweet cost of it. The stakes in Phenomenon aren't about losing status or money. They're about losing time, losing connection, and losing the comfort of being just like everyone else. When compared to more science-driven films like Lucy, 2014, which presents a highly exaggerated version of the unlocking the brain concept, Phenomenon feels almost minimalist. Lucy is packed with visual effects, grandiose theories, and an ever-escalating sense of cosmic power, while Phenomenon stays firmly rooted in human emotion and small-scale life. George's mind expands, but the film never veers into spectacle. It remains focused on his friendships, his love interest, his garden, his car, and his quiet moments of self-reflection. Where Lucy goes outward into the universe, Phenomenon goes inward into the heart. Looking at the director's filmography, Jon Turteltaub is known for films that often balance entertainment with emotional storytelling. He directed While You Were Sleeping, 1995. Another story that takes place in an ordinary world, but is driven by personal connection, misunderstanding, and emotional growth. Later in his career, Turteltaub would go on to direct the National Treasure films, which lean heavily into adventure, mystery, and pacing. What's fascinating is that Phenomenon sits right in the middle of these two creative instincts. It's not a light romantic comedy, and it's not an action-driven mystery. It's Turteltaub at his most thoughtful, using his knack for making accessible, audience-friendly films to quietly explore deeper philosophical ideas. Unlike the thrill-seeking energy of National Treasure, Phenomenon doesn't rely on plot twists or fast pacing to hold your attention. It relies on curiosity, empathy, and the slow unraveling of a man's life as it transforms. If you compare it to other Jon Travolta films, you can see Phenomenon playing a very specific role in his career arc. Travolta was coming off the wave of Pulp Fiction, 1994, which reintroduced him to Hollywood as a charismatic, edgy leading man. Many of his post-**Pulp Fiction** choices leaned into cool, stylish, sometimes morally gray characters. Phenomenon cuts directly against that grain. George Malley is not cool. He's not mysterious. He's earnest, vulnerable, and openly caring. It's almost as if Travolta used this role to remind audiences, and perhaps himself, that his strength wasn't just in style or attitude but in sincerity. It's a sharp contrast to his roles in Broken Arrow or Face/Off, where intensity and bravado dominated. In Phenomenon, Travolta slows down, softens, and invites the viewer into an emotional space that his more action-oriented films rarely touch. When you compare Phenomenon to films that deal with unexplained gifts or supernatural talents like The Green Mile, 1999, the difference lies in how the film approaches the community around the gifted individual. In The Green Mile, the supernatural abilities are surrounded by cruelty, systemic oppression, and the moral failings of others. In Phenomenon, the community isn't actively evil or violent, they're just afraid. Their rejection of George doesn't come from malice, but from confusion and discomfort. It's a quieter form of isolation, and arguably a more relatable one. It speaks to the way ordinary people might pull away from what they don't understand. Not out of hatred, but out of fear of the unfamiliar. Even when placed next to Awakenings, 1990, which shares the theme of sudden, miraculous mental change, Phenomenon again takes the more understated route. Awakenings is steeped in the world of medicine and clinical observation, while Phenomenon wraps itself in simplicity, focusing more on the social and emotional ripples of George's change than on the scientific specifics. When we think about similar films in terms of storytelling structure, Phenomenon resists the typical Hollywood formula. It isn't building toward a climactic showdown, a high-stakes decision, or a grand moral lesson. It unfolds more like life does, gradually, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes beautifully, sometimes tragically. It sidesteps the hero's journey structure, where a character gains something external, a prize, a victory, a conquest. George's journey is more about acceptance and understanding, not conquest or mastery. It shares DNA with character-driven films like Forrest Gump, 1994, in the sense that it's more interested in watching someone move through life's emotional highs and lows than in tracking a specific mission or external challenge. The soundtrack, the pacing, the cinematography, everything about Phenomenon is built to complement this more reflective, emotional tone. It's not a film that wants to dazzle or shock you. It wants you to think, to feel, and maybe to walk away wondering about your own life, your own potential, and how you might be seen by those around you if something about you suddenly changed. In this way, Phenomenon offers something subtly different within its genre, and within its time. It doesn't lean into the spectacle, or the darkness often associated with stories about sudden power. It invites you to slow down, to sit with the questions, and to feel the quiet beauty of an extraordinary experience lived in an ordinary world. It may have followed some familiar story paths, but the way it chose to walk them, gently, patiently, with deep emotional care, makes it stand out in a sea of louder, faster, more grandiose films. It carves out its own space by trusting that the small, human moments are often the ones that linger longest. Let's dive deeper into the entire financial journey, production backdrop, marketing dynamics, and long-term cultural footprint of Phenomenon, because when you start looking at the full picture, you realize this film quietly achieved something most mid-budget dramas struggle to do. It not only made money, but it earned a lasting emotional place in popular memory. Starting with the budget. Phenomenon was made with a production budget of approximately $32 million, which by mid-90s Hollywood standards positioned it in the sweet spot for thoughtful, star-driven dramas. It wasn't a financial gamble like high-concept science fiction films, nor was it a shoestring independent project fighting for attention. This budget allowed the filmmakers to secure Jon Travolta, who was absolutely at the peak of his second career wave following Pulp Fiction, 1994, Get Shorty, 1995, and Broken Arrow, 1996. Travolta's box office power at that moment was undeniable. He could open films based on his name alone. But what's interesting is how the rest of the production remained modest and carefully focused. Instead of inflating the budget with unnecessary special effects or sprawling sets, the film stayed tightly grounded in simple, intimate locations, small town streets, a local bar, George's workshop, and open countryside. Every dollar went toward creating a believable, accessible world that felt like it could belong to any viewer. The visual effects in Phenomenon are a perfect example of smart budgeting. They're sparse, brief, and only appear when absolutely necessary to support the story. When George moves objects with his mind or processes complex information at lightning speed, the effects are subtle and never flashy. There are no overblown CGI sequences, or attempts to compete with the more effects-heavy films of the time. This restraint not only saved money, but it also fit the tone of the film, which wasn't about the spectacle of power. It was about the quiet awe of transformation. On the marketing side, the promotional team behind Phenomenon made a series of very intentional choices. They didn't sell the film as a science fiction thriller, even though the core of the story revolves around unexplained abilities. They leaned into the human story, the romance between George and Lace, and the emotional stakes of George's transformation. The trailers and posters were centered on Jon Travolta's approachable, warm expression, his outstretched hand, and the gentle intrigue of what's happening to George, rather than on the powers themselves. The tagline used phrases like "some things in life just can't be explained," which set the tone as curious, mystical, and inviting rather than intense or action-packed. This strategy paid off because the audience that Phenomenon attracted wasn't necessarily the hardcore science fiction crowd. It was a broader, more mainstream group of viewers who were looking for something emotional, something uplifting, something a little magical but not too far removed from everyday life. In a summer season typically dominated by high-octane blockbusters, Phenomenon became a counter-programming success, a movie people could go see for a more reflective, heartfelt experience. At the box office, Phenomenon made over $152 million worldwide, with a significant portion of that coming from the domestic market. For a film that cost just over $30 million to make, this was a spectacular financial return. It didn't need to rely on international markets to turn a profit. It did exceptionally well right at home. What makes this even more impressive is that it was competing with other big summer films in 1996 like Independence Day and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Yet Phenomenon held its own by offering something those films didn't: quiet emotion and a small, personal story that viewers could connect to in a deeply individual way. But the story of Phenomenon doesn't stop at the box office. Its long-term success unfolded in the home entertainment market. The VHS release of Phenomenon became a staple in many households. It was the kind of film that people would rent repeatedly or purchase to have on their shelves because it offered a comforting, feel-good experience. It wasn't polarizing. It didn't demand intense concentration or reward repeat viewing with plot twists. Instead, it offered a steady, reliable emotional journey that audiences could return to whenever they wanted to feel something genuine and heartfelt. When DVDs entered the market, Phenomenon saw another round of popularity as people added it to their personal collections. Cable television played a massive role in solidifying Phenomenon's legacy. It became one of those films that channels would return to again and again, especially during weekend programming slots or family-friendly time blocks. Its pacing, tone, and broad appeal made it perfect for casual rewatches. It didn't matter if you started watching halfway through. You could always catch up, and the emotional beats still landed. Over time, it became part of that quiet category of films that sneak into cultural consciousness not through aggressive branding or franchise building, but through repeated, sincere exposure. What's also fascinating is that Phenomenon never really tried to set up sequels or expand its story into a broader cinematic universe, which is what so many studios chase today. It stands alone, and that gives it a certain timeless quality. Its simplicity is its strength. It's not trying to set up a bigger mythology or leave you with a cliffhanger. It tells one complete, satisfying story and trusts that this is enough to keep audiences coming back. When you compare its financial model to modern mid-budget films, Phenomenon almost feels like a blueprint for the kind of success that's increasingly rare in today's industry landscape. It hit that sweet spot, big enough to attract major stars and solid marketing, small enough to be profitable without needing to dominate the global market. It's the kind of film that modern studios often struggle to make now, because they're either aiming for tiny indie films or massive, franchise-driven blockbusters. Phenomenon lived comfortably in the middle and thrived. Even now, decades later, Phenomenon is still referenced when people talk about Jon Travolta's most memorable roles. It's remembered as a gentle, human story that surprised audiences with how much it made them feel. It's often included in lists of underrated emotional dramas, or films that quietly became classics. Its legacy isn't loud, but it's persistent. It never really left the cultural conversation. It just became part of the steady hum of films that people remember fondly, revisit often, and recommend with a certain quiet affection. So when you really expand the view of its production, box office journey, marketing decisions, home video success, and long-term cultural impact, Phenomenon stands out as a perfect example of a mid-budget, emotionally driven film that didn't just find financial success. It found a lasting place in people's hearts. If you're looking to experience Phenomenon today, you're stepping into the world of a film that has gracefully transitioned from the big screens of the 90s to the cozy living rooms of modern audiences. This is one of those movies that has fully settled into its second life through streaming platforms, digital rentals, cable broadcasts, and physical media, giving viewers plenty of options to enjoy it. Back in 1996, Phenomenon was a theatrical event, a film people went out to see with their families or significant others, drawn to its heartfelt story and the magnetic presence of Jon Travolta on the big screen. Watching it in theaters then gave audiences the full communal experience, sitting in a darkened room, collectively absorbing George Malley's incredible journey. But now, the film has comfortably become a part of the home viewing experience, and that's where its true staying power has flourished. Today, Phenomenon can usually be found on several popular streaming services. It tends to pop up on platforms that specialize in classic and popular films from past decades, sometimes rotating through different services, depending on licensing agreements. So if you're subscribed to one of the big streaming platforms, chances are you might stumble upon it in their catalog, sitting there quietly, waiting to be rediscovered. It's the kind of film that occasionally gets featured in curated collections like feel-good classics, 90s gems, or movies that make you believe, making it easy to spot when you're browsing. Streaming is a great way to watch it because you can dive in immediately, whether you're revisiting it after years or watching it for the first time. For those who prefer a more traditional approach, Phenomenon is widely available through digital rental and purchase. Platforms that offer on-demand movie rentals typically keep Phenomenon in their libraries because it remains a consistently requested title. Renting or purchasing the digital version is a solid option if you want to watch it without waiting for it to cycle back onto your favorite streaming service. This way, you can control when and how you watch it, whether it's on your TV, tablet, or even your phone if you're in the mood for a personal, intimate viewing. Digital purchases also often come with the bonus of higher video quality and sometimes, behind-the-scenes features or interviews that give you a bit more context about the film's production. Physical media lovers aren't left out either. Phenomenon has long been a staple in DVD collections, and you can easily find it in stores, online marketplaces, or even second-hand shops where it still sits proudly on the shelves. The DVD version often includes basic menu options, maybe a trailer, and sometimes even commentary tracks, depending on the edition. For the full nostalgic effect, there's something charming about popping the disc into a player and watching it the old-school way, complete with the classic studio intro and the grainy warmth that comes with earlier home video transfers. There's also a Blu-ray edition for those who want to experience the film in a slightly sharper, cleaner format while preserving that 90s aesthetic. Cable television remains another avenue where Phenomenon continues to find new viewers. It's one of those movies that still shows up on weekend schedules, especially on channels that focus on family dramas, uplifting stories, or 90s cinema. The cable experience is a bit like the way many people originally encountered the film. It's there when you're flipping channels, and suddenly you're pulled in, even if you've arrived halfway through George's story. There's something serendipitous about catching it on TV, where you can watch without planning, just like audiences used to do in the days before streaming libraries made everything instantly available. When thinking about the best way to watch Phenomenon for the fullest impact, it's really about the setting. This isn't a film that needs IMAX screens or booming surround sound. It thrives in quiet, comfortable spaces. Watching it at home, maybe in the evening, with minimal distractions, allows the emotional beats to land just right. It's the kind of film you can watch alone if you're in a thoughtful mood, or with friends and family if you want to share something uplifting and quietly magical. It's also a perfect candidate for rewatching on a lazy afternoon, when you're looking for something that doesn't rely on fast pacing or loud moments, but instead invites you to sink into the story and connect with the characters. Whether you choose to stream it, rent it digitally, pick up a physical copy, or stumble across it on television, Phenomenon is readily accessible and continues to offer that same blend of gentle wonder and heartfelt storytelling that made it so memorable when it first premiered. It's a film that has found its natural home in the hands of audiences who appreciate movies that linger with you, not because of spectacle, but because of how they make you feel.